11th, 2008. Will you please stand to say the Pledge of Allegiance with us?
Whoa. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Falcone. Francisco.
Here.
Horton.
Here.
House. Schneider.
Here.
Williams.
Here.
Mayor Bloom.
Here. We understand that Ms. Falcone is not feeling well today, so she's probably watching from home, so we'll say hello. Yeah, we hope she'll feel better. Okay, could you read the next? We only have one item today, so go ahead and read it.
Plan Santa Barbara Draft Policy Preferences Report and Next Steps for Environmental Impact Report.
Okay, and what we're going to do today is have a staff report. It'll be interesting for us. We have a stack of things that we've been reading on it, and we have some planning commissioners here, I know, to talk to us, and then we want to hear from the public. And then we have this on our agenda for next Tuesday evening, in which the council will be, we want to hear from you today and from the staff, and then next Tuesday we will be talking about it. So that helps. Okay, who am I turning this over to? Ms. Weiss.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. Staff is very happy to be here today for your special meeting on Thursday, December 11th. And we are providing the Council with an important overview of the Plan Santa Barbara process and the proposed draft policy preferences, which represent significant development in updating the city's general plan. The staff report today will be provided primarily by John Ledbetter, with comments additionally with Rob Dayton. The entire staff team, Plan Santa Barbara team, has been very fortunate and feels very rewarded by having worked on the Plan Santa Barbara project these last 2 years. The presentation today will provide an overview of the major achievements and direction that we've now taken in bringing to you the draft policy preferences, as well as some information about things to come as we continue in the Plan Santa Barbara process. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to John Ledbetter for the presentation.
Okay, Mr. Ledbetter.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. Weiss, and Madam Mayor, members of the Council, good morning. We are very pleased to be here after 3 years of work, and this is a culmination of a lot of community input, a lot of effort by the staff, a lot of effort by the Planning Commission, and we are very proud of the results, and we think that this is a very excellent reflection of what we've heard from the community. Not always all of it in a consensus, but we think it fairly reflects what we have heard. So what I'd like to do today is present what we feel is the purpose and need for this document and the process, go over the process timeline briefly, look at the general plan framework, which is a key component of this, and then look at the individual components that make up the Plan Santa Barbara document. Talk about a little bit about a couple of next steps, and then the recommendation. We'll put that up so people can look at that and as the public comment is opened. As you know, you set our direction and goal back in 2005 and asked us to look at the sunset of Measure E, our growth management program for non-residential development. The second thing you asked us to look at was updating our housing element, which is due next year in August, updating our environmental policies to become more sustainable, and we were provided with a set of 8 goals to help guide us through this process that focused our attention on living within our resources, promoting more affordable housing, ensuring that we have convenient transportation, a strong economy. We continue to think regionally. We preserve and protect our unique character here in Santa Barbara. We have adequate services, and that we ensure that the entire community can participate in this process. What we found as we went through this process and through a tremendous amount of community input, was that in fact the council goals were affirmed by what we heard from the community. And we started the process in a very open-ended manner. And what we heard again was we need to manage growth in Santa Barbara. It can't be just laissez-faire, whatever. We need to promote affordable housing, and our environmental policies do need to be updated. And specifically what we heard is they need to be updated in a sustainable way. We need to look at things in a comprehensive fashion and not just look at our resources, but look at our land development. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there were and continue to be some divergent opinions on a number of issues, particularly on the level of growth, our development standards, and what exactly constitutes community character. So now proceed to the timeline here. Phase 1, as I mentioned, started out with the council goals, with your appointment of the outreach committee, the development of the conditions, trends, and issues report, and update of our environmental baseline, and particularly the master environmental assessment maps. In 2007, we kicked off the formal outreach process, and that under the direction of the Community Outreach Committee, we mailed a citywide brochure with a mailback on input onto the process, conducted over 40 grassroots meetings, with a lot of assistance from the Outreach Committee, and a couple of council people were very instrumental in making this process work for us, as was the Planning Commission, and conducting 4 public workshop series in a very open-ended fashion. We also launched our website and began a series of check-ins with the boards and commissions. And as you recall then, in 2006, there was a break between Phase 1 to conduct the Upper State Street planning process. We're now in Phase 2, 2008, and that was begun early last year with the publication of our Development Trends Report that looked at development trends over the last 18 years. This was followed by a series of workshops to better understand, okay, well, how do we translate that, to begin to translate that public input that we've received, tremendous amount of public input, and what the facts are in terms of our development trends. That was how we then shaped the policy options report, and based on that we held another series of workshops to get feedback from the community. Are we on the right track? Are these the policies that you think reflect the input that you've given us? And then from there, we developed the policy preferences report. And again, back to the community. Does this reflect what you have told us? And so every step of the way, we've checked in with the community and made sure that we're on track with what we're hearing. And then we conducted a youth survey, as well as a telephone survey. And again, it affirmed what was initially set out by the council, what the communities told us, and did confirm that there are a couple of divergent areas, and particularly on building heights. I mean, as we all know, that's one of the real sticking points here. And then in 2002, at the beginning, almost a year ago today, we began working very closely with the Planning Commission. They established a subcommittee, and we worked really hand in glove with the Planning Commission to begin working through the policy development to ensure that these were state-of-the-art as well as a reflection of the community's opinions and desires. And that brings us to where we are today for council direction to move into Phase 3. Phase 3 is scheduled for early next year, for January, and that'll be kicked off with the formal environmental impact assessment process with a notice of preparation and a scoping hearing that will be conducted at the Planning Commission. We also in tandem be conducting an economic study to supplement the environmental assessments and to make sure that whatever policies we come up with, that they in fact will pencil out, and to get a better understanding of what the economic trends are, which clearly is very timely now. Staff will also be working on the land use element and the associated land use map, the housing element, and an adaptive management program. these will all be the outcomes, the products that you'll see at the end of 2010 when it comes time to certify the final EIR and the adoption of the final policies. And I'd just like to, one quick comment here is that, you know, we are entering phase 3, and it really is a point where we're assessing these draft policies, and we're tightening them up, we're looking more closely at them, and there will be some change to those. And I want to reassure people that this is not, you know, the end of the process, but it's moving into another phase of assessment, and that's a real important point. And then finally, phase 4 is implementation after adoption, and that's where we begin to look at updating the zoning ordinance, the overall implementation of the sustainable neighborhood planning efforts, form-based coding, and finalizing the overall general plan document. So the general plan, the general plan framework, what exactly constitutes that? We developed this diagram with the Planning Commission, and we feel that it's very instructive to understand the thinking that went into this process and really how it plays out. And the policy drivers, and I'll explain in a moment what a policy driver is really central to this concept, because it also it informs both the sustainability principles as well as the general plan elements themselves. The sustainability principles are key to this. They're the framework of our general plan update. This is what the community has told us. They want our general plan. They want our community to be moving even further towards sustainability. Adaptive management is part of that. It's key to that in terms of ensuring that this system, if you will, works. And of course, then there's the required elements of the general plan and the goals, objectives, policies that are outlined in this report, in this document. The policy drivers themselves are the issues that underlie the key policy questions. They tend to be controversial, and they also touch on a number of different general plan elements. As such, growth management, of course, energy and climate change, economic and fiscal health, community character, and public health. You know, these are issues that most of them that we've heard of, and they're not new to the Santa Barbara community, but some of them, like energy, climate change, and public health, are emerging newer issues that have been taken up into this process as it has evolved and matured. Growth management in particular, as you know, this was one of the issues that you directed us to look at as Measure E, our growth management provision of the charter, is sunsetting next year in 2010. It has been tremendously effective in limiting new growth while at the same time encouraging infill and redevelopment. This has been a very successful element of Measure E. We've also seen a lot of mixed-use development in our downtown, which is partly due to Measure E and this encouragement of development inwards rather than spreading outwards. This has also, of course, been helped by the market and the housing boom of the last 15 years. However, as part of that, we've also seen the growth of large condos. And I'll mention that a little bit further as well. So then the question becomes, you know, how much more non-residential growth do we want to see? What types of uses should constitute this new amount of square footage, and where exactly should it be located? Energy and climate change, it really, a lot of it comes down to our dependence on fossil fuel. I think the consequences, as everybody knows, can be fairly dire on a global level, but they also affect our pocketbook, and they hit us right here at home. And as we saw 6 months ago, with the incredible price of gasoline shooting up over $4.50 a gallon, restricting mobility, arresting economic development, affecting food production, and then, of course, all the climate change effects that have been so well documented and discussed on an international level. Implications, it is indeed a multifaceted problem, and I think the community here wants to do their part to affect these issues because they are so long-term, they're so compelling, and they do affect the future generations as well as our own life. And so on a planning level, we do have directives now from the state through AB 32 and SB 375 to ensure that our future planning efforts accommodate energy change and climate change. And the good news is that Plan Santa Barbara goes a long way to meeting those requirements. Community character, key issue here. We've seen the trends of redevelopment and infill. Those have been largely successful, mixed use, some transit-oriented development. And we've also seen some large single-family additions, which have been somewhat problematic. Larger structures in our commercial areas tend to have created bigger condos, and we have experienced some loss of openness, mountain views. But on the positive side, we have seen a lot of good improvements in our public realm with wider sidewalks, lush landscaping, paseos, and beautiful, beautiful architecture. And as a response, we've seen a fairly swift response in terms of design review through, well, the MPO, was that swift? Well, we did see a reaction through MPO, an effective one, and the enactment of the Single Family Design Board and the ABR and the HLC findings. Implications, this is really a key question here of, what is the proper combination of development standards that are going to be needed to balance and preserve our small town character that is so important to us with our other general plan goals of, maintaining our quality of life here and preserving what we have for the future. Economic and fiscal health, again, this is I don't have to tell you how important this issue is as it comes home to roost here for us. And central to this, for us, has been and continues to be the loss of affordable housing and what that means in terms of our socioeconomic diversity and its impact on local businesses. This is something, again, we heard from the community. They are concerned about corporate businesses coming in and the struggle for small local businesses. And our funding for public services and infrastructure is a concern and it will continue to be clearly. Some of the consequences as we see it are long-distance commuting, more long-distance commuting, overcrowding in our overcrowding and illegal dwellings, the difficulty for worker recruitment and retention, and the option when you don't have the capital to invest in your infrastructure, you end up deferring maintenance, and that comes at a greater and greater cost. So again, some of these implications are, well, how can we continue to press for affordable housing, and how do we look to the future in terms of shaping our economy to be more adaptive in terms of a more green economy and promote fiscal health of our city. Finally, public health as a policy driver is something that emerged, and this is a new issue that is typically not covered by urban planning, but more and more we're seeing studies that have come out that have that demonstrate that clear link between the built environment and public health issues, particularly of active lifestyles and healthy active lifestyles. And we're seeing this incredible increase in obesity, respiratory diseases, and diabetes, and they're being reflected right back in terms of what are you promoting? What types of living environments are you promoting? So, if things continue as they are, there's less opportunity for a change in lifestyles. In the long term, a decrease in productivity and quality of life and increased healthcare costs. So you see here, policy drivers are really central to this process, and this is what not only we've heard from the community, but these are the issues of the day that we're confronting and we're trying to address through this process. And sustainability principles, we feel, address these well. And we start with the tripartite of equity, environment, and economy, and this is kind of the classic definition of sustainability. And yet, these principles are shaped for our community, so they're more meaningful for what, as a more sustainable Santa Barbara mean? It means that we do maintain our socioeconomic diversity. We're promoting a healthy community with equal access for all members of the community, and that we provide information to all, and we encourage as wide a participation in all the processes that we can. And we feel very committed to that. On an environmental level, living within our resources continues to be one of our central tenets and missions here in the city of Santa Barbara. And that, coupled with how we husband our natural resources and our small town character, that is part of sustaining Santa Barbara, is the character that we have here that is so precious to us. And then finally, a multimodal transportation system where it makes driving your car as a choice, not something that's forced upon you because you have no other means to get around town. And finally, the economics of it all, maintaining our central position on the Central Coast or on the South Coast as a cultural and economic center, and ensuring that there's economic diversity here, that we're fiscally sound, and we're able to adapt to the climate change impacts, and that will become, we feel, more and more of an issue. So finally here, this is the definition that culminates really those principles that Santa Barbara is a diverse community that strives to live within its resources, its resource capacities, and integrate all aspects of its ecosystem while protecting and improving the natural and built environment for the social and economic benefit of present and future generations. So again, you see in terms of the framework, how important the principles are. They relate directly to the issues, the policy drivers, and those in turn inform the general plan elements, policies, and goals. And this is an important point I would like to really underscore here. The goals, policies, and objectives, what do they mean in Plan Santa Barbara? Well, these are new or changed policies that we are we've heard from the community that they want to incorporate into the general plan. But that doesn't mean that all the existing policies and the existing elements go away. Those all remain in place. And this is something that's been a concern for a variety of constituencies in the community. The historic resource community, if you will, has been very concerned about this, that, they want to make sure that the existing policies are not going away, and we want to reassure those folks, as well as people like MTD that are concerned about the circulation policies and what a great circulation element we have. That's not getting thrown out. Those remain in place until we get to that point where we're ready to re-examine those policies and amend and adopt those. And then finally, the last point about the policies that you're seeing here in front of you in the Plan Santa Barbara document, these do constitute the project description in the EIR. So that's a good way to look at what we are bringing before you today is, quote, the project description on which we're going to base our environmental assessment and economic assessments. So a few of the key components of Plan Santa Barbara are listed here. And I'll go in a little bit more detail, and Rob will assist here on some of these. But obviously, growth management is key. What is being proposed as part of Plan Santa Barbara is to limit non-residential square footages to 2 million square feet through the planning cycle, and residential units to 2,800 based on the historic trends that we've seen over the last 18 years. This would be a continuation of that. And I'll get into that in a little bit here, more detail. This is coupled with community benefit. Land uses, another key component here. All these policies work together. That's the way they're designed. Economic policies, our mobility-oriented development, that's where we're focusing future growth, and it really is tied closely with land use and transportation really come hand in hand in here. Reduced unit sizes and amend variable density. Again, this is something we heard from the community. Everybody is concerned about large condominiums and what that means in terms of our community character and our socioeconomic diversity. mixed-use standards, form-based coding for compatible size, bulk, and scale, affordable design, housing incentives, rental housing incentives, second units, sustainable neighborhood plans, setback, open space, and landscaping standards, historic resources, and parking standards. So just a couple of these, I'll go into a little bit of detail. I think that they warrant that. In terms of growth management, a couple of considerations that are important here is to understand that what's being proposed here as part of Plan Santa Barbara is to extend the remaining Measure E square foot balance. And what that will mean is that what's left will need to be reallocated. And it's a little bit complex. I'm not going to get into all the details about that now, but this is something that we'll be working on next year. We'll be putting more time into assessing, well, what is exactly are the community benefit land uses that would constitute this reallocation, and exactly how much square footage would go to each one, that sort of thing. In terms of residential, again, as I mentioned earlier, likely build-out based on historical trends is about 2,800 units. And we don't see that really changing during the next planning period. But what we do want to focus on is the type, location, and design, the size of these units, not the rate or the numbers. That being said, we will be looking at different numbers, lower amounts of residential and higher amounts of residential as part of the environmental review process. So again, it's good to put growth management in context. I like to continually remind people about the next increment of growth and what it is really that we're looking at here. We have 21 million square feet on the ground today of non-residential and about 37,400 dwelling units on the ground today. So this next increment of growth that we're looking at, and again, this is something that we heard from the community, and we checked in with the community, and they're comfortable. They recognize that growth management is key to maintaining our character. And so what increment does the community want to look at? Well, but for non-residential, it's somewhere between 1 and 3 million square feet, 3 million square feet being the original amount of Measure E, and somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 additional units. So when you look at that next increment of growth is not huge. And so it's important that we consider carefully how that gets used and how we meter it out, not only how we meter it out, but what those uses constitute. So that being said, the growth management topic was one that the Planning Commission spent a lot of time and worked very diligently to come up with policies that meet a variety of different concerns. And one clear concern that there's consensus across the board, I can safely say, is the first one, that any future development needs to give priority to affordable housing. It cuts across so many of our issues. The second policy is indeed renew Measure E for non-residential as a growth management tool, but it needs to be subject to available resources. So this is where we begin to see how the adaptive management program really plays into that, to monitor that and to ensure that we don't exceed our resource capacities. And here, if you'll notice in the document, we do call out a square foot number of for the project of 2 million square feet of non-residential. Now that's a little different on the LG3, which is the policy that deals with our affordable housing. And here, again, encouraging affordable housing is the #1 goal, but it does have to be subject to available resources. And water and sewer are key to understanding that we can't live beyond our resources. But we do want to be able to build the housing that we need and to meet the requirements of the state housing element goals and policies. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky, but we feel that by encouraging affordable housing, monitoring closely through adaptive management program, and then being able to demonstrate to the state that in fact we do have the capacity to meet their numbers, we can meet a number of different objectives through this policy. So just briefly touching on the other alternatives to growth management that we'll be looking at through the environmental process. the first one would be no project, and essentially that's business as usual. All the policies remain in the same, and with that we would expect to see about 2.2 million square feet of non-residential, and again about 2,800 residential units. For the project itself, as I mentioned, we're projecting a 2 million square foot cap for non-residential and 2,800 dwelling units based on historical trends. Again, but the emphasis here is on the policies that make the difference in terms of location, design, and unit size. So that's really a big difference between the project and the no project alternative. Alternative one then begins to look at, well, what's the low growth alternative? And here we would look at policies such as lowering the building heights, higher parking requirements, retaining our existing second unit restrictions, which is they're pretty high bar to meet right now, and ensuring that mixed use doesn't maximize both residential and non-residential in one project. And of course, limiting annexations through our sphere of influence would be another one of these policies. These would be the types of policies that we'll be analyzing in the EIR to try and affect this lower amount of growth, where you'd come out with 1.5 million square feet and 2,000 dwelling units. So similarly, looking at the inverse of that, we'll also look for alternative number 2 at a greater amount of development. And here we would look at the types of policies like retaining or increasing building height limits, increasing density provisions, lowering parking requirements, strongly encouraging second units, downshifting housing permit requirements. So in this kind of a scenario, you might see 2 million square feet of non-residential and as high as 4,500 dwelling units. And I just might add that that's full tilt. I mean, given that our historical trends over the last 18 years have been 2,800. And then finally, we will look at long-range full build-out, and what that would mean is, again, looking at this range that the community has given us to study, this would be the top end of 3 million square feet for non-residential and 7,000 dwelling units, which is our what we've calculated to be our capacity for residential units. So, and one last comment on this. Again, this is something that the Planning Commission has spent a lot of time on, working with us and making sure we get the right combinations here. And in the end, what we want to make sure is that we're analyzing in the EIR components that eventually, when we get towards the end of this process, we'll be able to fashion together a preferred alternative of, perhaps real low of one and real high of the other, or any certain combination that seems to work, given the analysis, the further analysis that is done through environmental review, economic study, and then input that we continue to receive through the tail end of the process as we go back to the Planning Commission and back to the Council.
One of the challenges that we received during the process from the community and the Planning Commission and the boards and commissions is trying to link the policy drivers. In other words, how does each element that we have in the general plan now link to each other? How do we bring a clear policy that addresses all the issues at once? And the mobility-oriented development area has really been something that's brought that together and brought the more holistic policy to bear. And what it is it's an area, I'm going to show you the map, that we're proposing to focus growth, so that would be commercial growth and redevelopment, new commercial growth and redevelopment around transit nodes within the what we're calling the MODA, and then provide a mix of land uses that is strong for work centers, that reintroduces the residential community in the downtown area, and then promotes a connectivity for civic engagement, and reprioritizes public space for people. And doing all those things, then providing mobility connectivity options to link the different forms of transportation, transit, bicycling, and go ahead and flip that, and pedestrians. And so you can see in the purple where what we're calling the MODA is outlined, and what constitutes a MODA is really about the mix of uses. So it's not just transportation that has this boundary. Although that's a big part of it. It's the land uses. You have a rich mix of the commercial and residential, our higher density residential is within the MODA. We also have a very strong transit support throughout the MODA. And then the bicycling and walking, the ease of bicycling and walking within this area is also strong. I want to mention that although we didn't feel it was appropriate to do the MODA out in the Mesa area or in the Coast Village Road because they don't have the same representation of commercial and residential in terms of more equality there. But we wanted to highlight them as transit nodes because we heard from those communities that there is an interest to provide transit connectivity to these areas in a higher form. So with that policy, what are we proposing to do with the MODA? Well, we're proposing that the transit-oriented development pattern, that around the nodes we will we'll try to draw the commercial intensification or the new growth in and around the transit nodes, that will look at residential densities and smaller unit size. This is where it kind of gets to the community character issue. Is one of the issues with the large condominiums is their size, and therefore because of their size we got bigger buildings on the outside and also consequently not the workforce housing in them. So we're looking at the community's really asked for us to look at the unit size to get the right person in there and the parking standards for those units, changing zoning for parking, and also that we got comments on the corner store. How can I have a convenient place to shop within my neighborhood? And actually some of the corner stores now are actually illegal. So bringing that zoning changes in. And then when we say parking, we really try to introduce this in the process because of the different types of parking. There's customer, employee, and residential. And this has been a strong facet, particularly of the downtown parking committee and the downtown businesses. They have always looked for a strong commercial customer-based parking, which we want to keep, and that is separate. And we're saying increase that, but then look at some of what we've looked at the employee parking and bringing that back, and the residential parking within the MODA, looking at those requirements, improving mobility options, increasing the public and open space, and creating active and healthy lifestyles within the MODA. So you can see where we've identified kind of the backbone of the transit system coming down state, and actually down De La Vina, because we're looking at one of the big nodes we miss is the Cottage Hospital neighborhood by going down State Street, and the commercial area on De La Vina. And then you can actually see with the commercial area how that backbone really begins to form, and then coming across Haley and Gutierrez over to Milpas. With secondary units, this was something I think that we were surprised to see a lot of support for, more secondary units. As it is now and as it's written, the requirements are pretty stringent, and we've only had approximately 10 units actually approved, so a very low amount. So in trying to introduce more flexible secondary units, because our housing element actually talks about looking at affordable by design and re-examining those standards, we looked at encouraging them in the MODA, because in the MODA there would be the combination of easy transit, accessible walking and pedestrian, bicycle and pedestrian areas. So, and then still allowing them outside of the MODA, but not looking at the design standards at all, at revisiting that, and then restricting them in the high fire zone, which they are now. So you can see the single-family neighborhoods that are in fact within the MODA, where the green which shows where the secondary, we would actually encourage the secondary units.
In terms of sustainable neighborhoods, this is a longer-term neighborhood planning effort, although, interestingly, we've already begun to see neighborhoods responding to this, particularly up on the Mesa and the Upper East Side, and so we feel that this is a really good indication that we're on the right track here, and this is what people want to see. They do look at their neighborhoods and then want to create or maintain that sense of place and community, and to provide better access to commercial and community services, oftentimes within walking distance or a short bike ride. Access to parks and open space is really critical to all the neighborhoods. as is good transit, bike, and pedestrian connections. Integrating the natural environment here, the watershed protection is critical, and creek restoration. Again, this is something we've heard over and over from the community. I mean, Measure B was a great reflection of that. But interestingly, we saw this on Upper State Streets too, as people really cherish the creeks and their connections and want to see how they can be best utilized in a multi-faceted way. And then finally, community gardens. That was a surprising amount of interest in further developing our community gardens, and also schools. There's some interesting. I didn't highlight this in particular, but this is a pet one of my own, of encouraging healthy foods in schools and gardens, granite gardens, that kind of thing. Historic resources are so key to our community and who we are and what our character is. What we're proposing here is a general plan element for historic resources with a full background description of Santa Barbara and the planning history here. As I mentioned earlier, there's no elimination of the existing policies. All the ones that are in the existing general plan elements will be maintained and consolidated into the new historic resources element. New policies will be added, and such as looking at adjusting the EPV district boundaries, and we'll be integrating all the results of our current work program, such as all the surveys of the historic structures, the districting proposals, incentives for historic preservation, and reviewing our demolition ordinance. So what are our next immediate steps? Obviously, we're getting back together on Tuesday for your deliberation, but assuming that we get the go-ahead, then we'll begin in January with the NOP and scoping process at the Planning Commission, and then we'll be coming back to you in February at your next work session with the Planning Commission to go through in detail exactly what our Phase 3 work program will constitute. So I'd like to just leave you with what the recommendation is here for today, and that is to initiate environmental review on our draft policy preferences report, which will serve as the draft general plan sustainability framework for the general plan, and it'll provide draft policy direction for updating the general plan and growth management and the growth management program. Specifically, what will help us with is providing direction to proceed with Phase 3, to draft the general plan land use element, continue work on the land use map and the housing element, and what I left off here is also the adaptive management program. So with that, we'll turn it back over to you, Madam Mayor, and we anticipate some comments from the Planning Commission, and I don't see any other commission representatives here. So for now, we'll turn it over to you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, we'll ask the Planning Commission if they would like to speak. Mr. Justice, Mr. White, and Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. For the record, John Justice, member of Planning Commission, also member of the subcommittee. I didn't realize that I had signed up for an extra credit course in addition to my regular duties as a planning commissioner.
We'll give you the extra credit you deserve. Good. Thank you.
But it's been quite a year. A year ago, the Planning Commission was very concerned about the direction of the process and the product that was coming out of it, and we were worried that this train was going to come off its tracks. And because of a collaborative effort between the Commission, the public, and staff, we have a document in front of you today that received the unanimous recommendation of the Planning Commission to move forward. And this is not your father or mother's general plan. This is a modernized general plan that has a number of very, very innovative and I think very forward-looking approaches. And I think staff has really done a very good job in responding to much of the tough love that we on the Commission and the public directed toward them in trying to get something that works. It's been very costly and very time-intensive to get to this point. And it has not been just smooth sailing. We've had some very difficult discussions, but I think what we've got here is very strongly supportable. It's not perfect, but it certainly is a very good start. And I think the subcommittee and the commission in particular sees its fingerprints all over this document at this point in time. We redirected the public participation process to take a little different course, and staff was supportive of that approach. We suggested that it be restructured to include a clear vision, which is in there, a new policy framework that references policy drivers, the adaptive management framework, and specific and internally consistent policies. And that's something that Mr. Thompson was really focused in throughout the process, is making sure we had a really coherent set of policies to bring to you today. And as I read through the staff report, it was very clear that that is the type of product we've got here today. As far as the substance, we worked really hard on land use and growth management policies 1, 2, and 3 in a way to try to balance the competing interests but shared values among this community in terms of providing housing opportunities, providing reasonable economic growth, and living within our resources. And that is the underlying theme of this document. And I think a majority of the commissioners in the attachment 1 to your packet, we had some disagreement over the amount of non-residential square footage. Many of us wanted to see 1.5 as opposed to 2.0 or 2.2, and that was reflected by a desire to be consistent with the sustainability piece. And we just feel that that's plenty of non-residential growth to consider over the next 20 years, given the uncertainties that we face regarding a whole number of resource issues. As an individual, I disagree with the concept of transferring traffic credits along with development rights. We saw the problems that these types of loopholes create when we looked at the project at Pedregosa and State Street, where a project site had been vacant for over 20 years, got a free pass through the environmental review process, and had no traffic analysis done on it. It had some traffic analysis, but it didn't trigger anything because they were credited with trips that a gas station created 20, 25 years ago. And I think that really undermines the credibility of the city's environmental review process, and that's the basis for my concern over these credits of traffic trips between transfer of existing development rights. The last piece I want to talk to you about is the EIR. We're glad to see this thing move forward. But the concept of studying an alternative that goes up to 3 million square feet, to me, is inconsistent with all of the goals and objectives of this document. And when you do an EIR, what do you use EIRs for? You use EIRs to identify alternatives that minimize environmental damage and mitigate significant unavoidable impacts. And if we've got a project that talks about approximately 1.5 million square feet of non-residential square footage, and we study an alternative that is twice that, it doesn't make sense to me why we're spending very, very limited public funds to expand the scope of an EIR when we really don't have any reason for doing so other than studying what the city could be. You can do that in another context, but to do it in an EIR makes absolutely no sense to me. I've voiced this concern, and this is probably the only major unresolved piece that I've got with the way the city is going forward. But that being said, the bottom line is please move forward on this today. Initiate the EIR process. It will further encourage public participation. And I think from all of the comments I've heard through a year's worth of public hearings, many of the folks who addressed us hold the same values And they want the same thing for Santa Barbara. It's about how you do it, and we have tried to work with staff and the public to structure this document so it meets many of those same interests. And I think it does that quite well. Thank you.
And thank you for stepping up to the plate a year ago. It was very good. Mr. White and then Mr. Thompson. After. Okay, bless you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm Bendy White, likewise a planning commissioner, and I have only a couple of comments to add to what John's said. Obviously, he covered the full landscape there. But one piece that I'd ask you to look at yet more reading before you decide your decision-making session is next Tuesday, as I recall. And as Mr. House and Ms. Bloom knows, the Planning Commission makes a real effort to confirm that the minutes are accurate and are a useful tool going forward. And that's not part of your packet today. I understand we have our this afternoon is when we have our final approval of those. But please give those a read before your decision making, because that really is a fuller version of our discussion. The comments I'd like to make on what you're discussing or what you're hearing today is, first of all, the Upper State Street study was a sidebar. It was a delay. No, what I came away with from the Upper State Street study was the general plan process in full flower, in a microscopic, on a portion scale, a test tube, as it were, of what we can do with the rest of the city. It brought together so many of the best elements of the people who came out and saw it. So the Upper State Street study, I really appreciate that the city took the time out to do that, to show us how to go forward in a fully participatory way. The density transfer, the whole TEDR element of Measure E, late in the process, very late in the process, the Planning Commission came across this and said, maybe we don't need to go forward with the TEDR as part of this would just be excised from the Measure E process. I think a majority of us bought into that, but it was not vetted with the full community, and certainly not the landowners and the people who would have the financial stake there. So while I really believe that that's true, that the TEDR, their days are outmoded, certainly that conversation needs to occur with all stakeholders fully aware and prepared to go forward. So I think it was useful 20 years ago when commercial was the highest and best use, and now with the inventory of square footage that we have, whether it's 1,000,005, 2.5, whatever the inventory that comes out of this general plan, there's plenty of square footage for each project to come into council and go, this is what we think is appropriate for this place. Here's how it fits in our resource use. How about it, council? So that's how I ask that we go forward with this, is first of all, of course, get a full community discussion, but the TEDR, in my view, is perhaps outmoded. And certainly adding the element to TEDR of transferring traffic impacts, perhaps put that in at the same discussion. I find no merit in it whatsoever, and yet it's been something that's been raised in the last several sessions. Finally, or not finally, but almost finally, one of the things that came out of the analysis of the city that was quite a shock to everybody was the number of units that can be built in the commercial corridor under the current mixed-use program. Added something like 5,000 units plus to our inventory of potential. It's been hidden for these 20 years. So how that's meted out, it just shows we have much more potential for growth than we ever thought we had. And it's all the more reason that the adaptive management piece come in, that we're staying within our resources, and that those are being focused, the development's being focused in ways that are for the best of the city. And then the land use element needs to happen first. We need to be looking at that hard before we then go to the housing element. And I'm glad to see that staff's got that in the right sequence, but I hope we have a little bit of time between those two elements, the land use and the housing, to get that right. And I want to second John's comment about not having such a high range in the non-residential square footage in the EIR alternatives. 3 million square feet is just unsustainable. It violates so many of our other of the general plan current and future objectives. Let's cut that down at least to 2.5 going forward, and have realistic alternatives to be looking at from 1 to 2.5 in the range of options in the EIR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. White. Mr. Thompson, and I haven't seen you since the Tea Fire, but I wanted to extend our condolences on your house. It's just always very hard, and I know you must have had lots of Planning Commission notes and everything else in there. That's.
I don't know anything about the general plan because it all burned up.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor and Council, I'll be brief. About almost exactly to the day 1 year ago, right here in this room, the Planning Commission, in a meeting with staff, decided that we needed to become more involved with the way the process was going, and we appointed a subcommittee of John Jostis and George Myers and myself, and we worked with staff this year and come up with a lot of the things that you see now in the policy preferences report that didn't exist before. And it's taken us a year to get here. My only message is we can spend a lot of time now at this juncture trying to make this a perfect policy preferences report, and everybody's got different opinions about every one of those policies, maybe more than one opinion about each one of those policies. And if we allow ourselves to get bogged down, this whole thing's just going to drag on, which was what our concern was a year ago. So I urge you, even if it's maybe not perfect with everything that you individually would like to see in there, to move along to start the environmental review process and to start the planning process, at which point we will be refining a lot of these policy preferences. And so I just want, my only message is I just wanted to say, don't allow us to try to craft the perfect document before we move to the next step, because the next step is really the beginning, not the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for all your work, too. Well, we have several. We have almost 30. Yeah, just a second. We have almost 30 people that want to speak, and we're, if you can be succinct and articulate and don't repeat things, that would be good. We have a couple questions up here, so we'll go to Ms. Schneider and then Mr. Williams.
Thank you.
Mr.
First off, thanks everyone for coming and those watching. I'll have a number of questions and comments later, but I have one big overarching question that I think a lot of people are going to ask about, so I want to get my head around it as soon as I can, and it has to do with the various alternatives of the EIR, specifically the no project alternative. If you could put actually that slide up, that might be help. Well, no, you didn't have the details up there, did you? Anyway, so there's the no project alternative in the project itself, and the numbers, as you look, are really, really similar. So the only difference is it's $2.2 million under dollars. 2.2 million square feet of commercial square footage under the no project versus 2 million, but the housing units are the same. And I guess my question is, and you mentioned it briefly, but if you could really help me get my head around it a little more, to explain why a no project alternative and the actual project are so similar, when what I'm also hearing is that this is not your mom and dad's old planning, general plan update. This is a modern version. And so can you expand on that a little more for me, please?
Is that better?
Certainly, Madam Mayor and Council Schneider. Yeah, we do get that question a lot, and it's a good one. What I was trying to explain earlier was that in terms of residential units, what we've based our recommendation on is the historical trend, what we've seen over not only the last 18 years but the last 10 years of concentrated development. We don't anticipate that we're going to see a whole heck of a lot more unless we really ratchet up our policies and become quite a bit more aggressive with those. And what we were trying to focus on are the types of projects that you're going to see and the location of them. In other words, you're going to see smaller units, you're going to see greener units, and you're going to see them located near transit. And we feel that these are the key policies that we want to emphasize and move forward. And we've heard that from the community. We haven't heard from the community as a consensus that we want to double them out and exactly how we would go about doing that. Now, that being said, we are studying what that might look like, and we are in the EIR going to look at what types of policies it would require if we wanted to double that and bring it up to 4,500. And that was the point that I was trying to make. Towards the end of this process, we'll be able to mix and match some of these components. So, for example, we could hold non-residential down at 1.5 and increase residential to 4,500, if that's what the community and the council so desires. But we just, as a staff, didn't really feel comfortable with that and coming out with pretty aggressive increases in densities in order to achieve that higher number. And so we felt that it was, given the market and given the policies, the emphasis is on types and location rather than ratcheting the number and creating a real difference between the no project and the project. And maybe Ms. Weiss would like to add something to that.
Ms. Weiss?
Yeah, I think there's another important consideration in looking at these numbers and what an EIR analysis is going to study and what we're talking about in terms of land use, density allowances, and policy. They come together on this chart because the chart has that there's a policy set, there's a projected amount of growth to study the physical environmental impacts of growth over approximately a 22-year period. So as Commissioner White noted, one of his important points to note was that the existing zoning allowances within our community are 7,000 or more when you look at what might be built in the commercial zones in terms of residential. So by studying a level of growth of 2,800 units and the fact that it's similar to the no project doesn't necessarily mean that we're limiting it to 2,800 or that's absolutely all that would happen, not more, not less. This is an environmental assessment of a reasonable case of what might occur. And the 7,000 unit number for environmental review is a very long-term look at let's have information about longer-term full development of these units in the commercial zone. That has not been looked at before, so we're doing an environmental analysis of that. And so that is different than the fact that the city has long-time established density allowances for residential. We've had mixed-use incentives that came out of the last general plan. How much did those mixed-use incentives and the available land and the market affect the residential development in the last 20 years? Not a lot. It focused more on the downtown because that's where the incentives went to. But our rate of residential development really has not changed that much. What component does land use zoning and planning have in terms of residential development? It's an important part of it, but it's only part of an overall equation that certainly includes larger economic issues as well. So again, it's very complex. It's not just, well, we're putting 2,800 units because we think it should be limited to 2,800 units. We're studying that because we think that's a reasonable assessment of what might happen in these 20 years. And these other numbers, like 4,500, really have to go with a different set of policies than the city currently has or are anticipated in Plan Santa Barbara, where we might change the density standards more upward in order to see if that would change the rate of growth up towards 4,500. And then the 7,000 is a long-range analysis. So I think it's hard to look at just that one thing and say, why is that the same number? That's why I'm explaining all of the numbers, because it's really what range will be studied in the EIR.
And I might just add one other comment to that, too. And I think it's important that you carefully look at the wording of our second growth management policy on housing in particular, because it's very intentional that there isn't a number there, and it's really guided by our resource capacities. And that's where the adaptive management program really comes into play and really makes this a more effective, we feel, not only document but program for metering out the amount of housing that gets developed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Williams and then Mr. Francisco.
I suppose this is a little bit of a follow-up to Councilmember Schneider's question, but in looking at the alternatives, it seems like there are alternatives that have very little commercial growth and very little housing, and there are alternatives that have a large degree of, or a moderate to large degree of commercial and a moderate amount of housing. But there's really no alternative that looks at having very little commercial growth and a moderate or large degree of housing, which, you know, would be a jobs housing strategy to, you know, potentially eliminate our jobs or reduce our jobs housing imbalance. And it maybe the things that it would take to accomplish that are too much for us to handle, but shouldn't we at least study that? I mean, to me, is that why didn't we study? Why aren't we studying that?
Mayor Bloom and Councilmember Williams, the amount of growth in Alternative 2 in terms of dwelling units at approximately 4,500 dwelling units over a 22-year period, that is a substantial increase in the idea of, you know, the amount and type and location of residential growth for our community over this type of planning period. So I think looking at the housing side of it, of your, you know, where is that combination? I think Alternative 2 certainly is going towards that question of yourself and from yourself and the community of, let's look at aggressively addressing affordable and workforce housing needs. And I think trying to target an alternative at 4,500 dwelling units would do that. Now, what is the balance of the equation in terms of non-residential growth, and how, I understand you're characterizing 2 million square feet is moderate, not a little bit of non-residential growth. So we provided an attachment in your council agenda report that breaks down these numbers of 1.5 and 2 million, and also looking at the history, what we found in our development trends study that we did earlier this year. I think to a large degree that the last 18 years we saw built in the community approximately 1.5 million new square footage of non-residential development. In the big scheme of things, that's not that much. I guess these are qualitative and judgment calls, but again, back on the slide, compared to the, I think it's 23 million square feet that exist on the ground today, the amount of non-residential growth that we experience in this community now under Measure E for these past 18 years could be characterized as not a lot of non-residential growth. So I guess it just depends. I think from staff point of view, looking at 2.0 million square feet as the Alternative 2 and the project, we feel is, based on the Planning Commission and community direction, a small or moderate amount of non-residential growth. So in Alternative 2, you have that coupled with an aggressive amount of residential. So staff's feeling is that Alternative 2 is our response to members of the community and yourself saying, let's have an alternative that looks at lower non-residential growth and higher residential growth. So we think that that alternative achieves it. However, we have heard from the community that they would like to see a smaller amount of non-residential growth. So that is in an alternative. And the point being here, the amount of information we get out of the CIR based on these different alternatives will allow the council in the end to make decisions about the amount and pace and location of this growth. And so I think you will learn from the EIR about what 1.5 million square feet means and how that may differ from an economic standpoint, from a community character standpoint, with the 2.0. So I think the EIR will provide that information even if those two aren't linked, the 1.5 and the 4,500.
So we will be able to somehow piece together the results of that EIR to be able to understand what it would be like if we did 1 or 1.5 million square foot of commercial growth combined with 4,500 square feet of.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And then just, Madam Mayor, I'm sorry, while I have the mic, I wanted to mention the full build-out analysis of 3 million and 7,000. Again, this is not a reflection of what we heard the community say they want Plan Santa Barbara to be.
Right.
So I want everyone to understand that that's not what this is. That is long-term full build-out. We didn't hear anyone say, let's look at reallocating 3 million square feet again for the next 20 years. Also, I can't imagine what our housing industry and community would be like if for 7,000 units to be studied in 20 years. So what that column or row is on the chart is really the prudent and practical thing to do when doing something such as this, such a major update of our general plan, and the fact that the 7,000 units have never really fully been analyzed. So we're, from a planning and environmental professional standpoint, that's why we call that the full build-out analysis. And so that's not being supported as this project's objectives. It's more of a baseline, longer-term analysis alternative.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Francisco.
Oh, I
you have
still
another one?
have
I'm
two
sorry.
more.
Go ahead.
Two more questions. On the policy LG7, which is the TEDRs, if we are going to get rid of a policy that allows us to move around commercial, is there any other alternative policy that would allow us to remove commercial from areas that it's creating a high traffic impact to areas that has a lower traffic impact? I mean, are we coming up with some other policy that will allow us to do that?
The policy LG7 was amended since the Planning Commission meeting. We inserted the word consider. The LG Policy 7, based on a Planning Commission work session on the growth management policies, we understood the direction from the Planning Commission to amend the city's zoning ordinance to eliminate the transfer of existing development rights program in effect. And then there was some community input and said, well, we think that you should really pull back from that, and we think that maybe even transfer of resources might be a good idea along with the TEDR program. So as drafted now, LG 7 just says consider amending the TEDR ordinance. It doesn't say, that you must or exactly how, and that one consideration would be that if a property becomes fully developed, then they don't have their TEDR credit, whereas another property, if they have not fully developed, they tore something down, they still may participate in a future TEDR. And then I tacked on the words at the end, and or other changes, because I felt that was responsive to the fact that the commission itself said, although we're interested, such as Commissioner White, who feels strongly about it, he also, I think, agreed that let's pull back and make this a consideration. So I think this policy, LG7, provides the opportunity that Councilmember Williams is saying that we may want to examine in the future.
Last question on second units. They're to be encouraged within the MODA and allowed within a certain area around the MODA. What's the difference between that? Is encouraged meaning that we're going to change the policies and allowed is the current policies, or what? Oh, okay.
The answer to that is yes.
All right. It's intuitive. That's great.
Mr. Francisco. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First, just to follow up on Mr. Williams's first question, my understanding, if I recall correctly, the trend over the past 10 years, I think it was that we've had about 100 new residential units built in the city every year. Was that the right number?
Actually, the last 10 years has been a little bit higher, but
Okay.
typically approximately 100 units a year. But in the last 10 years, because of some of the booming going on in the mixed-use projects downtown, it was a bit higher.
Okay. And do you know the average number of non-residential square feet added per year over that period?
I think we had it, was it 66,000? We just had, Adam just ran those numbers. Right? Yeah, 68? 68,000 square feet per year.
Okay.
20 years, 1.4. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. A few questions about the so-called MODA. I notice in the map there it refers to a dedicated transit line and a transit nodes. Could you explain what those are?
Yes, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Francisco. The dedicated transit line, I think that I don't think it was our intention to keep dedicated in there. I'm not sure. The main reason to outline the yellow line, it's kind of faint, but you can see it follows what we're calling the spine or the backbone of connecting the dots. Is represented up there to be a main transit thoroughfare, a place where you'd want a strong transit supported. And then the transit nodes were placed according to the type of village centers that are logically or naturally forming at those locations, places that you would want to connect with strong transit. And I will say that, MTD at this time serves that route very, very well. And I did mention in the presentation that there is a possibility we might want to make an adjustment to the main route to pick up the dots that are perhaps not being connected, which is the De La Vina commercial area and the Cottage Hospital area.
So the word dedicated isn't supposed to be there, or?
No, in fact, we can even amend that out.
Okay. Do you happen to know, and if you don't, that's okay, but I would like to find out, do you happen to know what the current population density is within this area that you're designating MODA?
I don't believe we have the answer to that question, but
Okay.
we can get that. We'll try to get that.
Okay, that'd be great. And then a few questions about the policies themselves. Just to clarify things, on page 18 of the policy preferences, this is the vision of a sustainable Santa Barbara. Just one question regarding, if you look at the second column, just a couple sentences down, it says, this vision of the future, land uses which serve local needs have displaced those which do not. Could you explain what that means? I mean, one of the questions that immediately came to my mind was that, does that mean we're eliminating tourism as a land use?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I think partly what that refers to is local businesses that serve local needs and displays that those who do not. I mean, that's something that we heard through the community process quite a bit, that there was a concern about the loss of local businesses that serve local community, and a concern that other businesses are coming in that do cater to the tourists. So that is fairly strongly worded there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then flipping over to land use policies, this is on page 29. This is looking at LG9, section B, the last bullet item in section B. A policy here is to reprioritize public space for people. Could you tell me what that means?
You mean C? I think you mean C. Oh, B. Okay. Thank you. I thought you said E.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, I think the emphasis there is that within the MOTA, it needs to be a highly pedestrian-oriented area. And so as we look at public realm improvements, we want to make sure that the pedestrian is accommodated as it is the beginning and end of all trips.
Okay.
And so that there's a strong pedestrian aspect to the public realm.
Okay, very
I
good.
just think of those pictures of Upper State Street when the sidewalk was barely 2 feet wide, but there was some big utility box there.
Mm-hmm.
That felt more for, it didn't feel right for the person.
Okay, I see. And if we could look over at page 32, this is neighborhood policy, LG 15, again, section B.
32. LG 15.
Neighborhood serving commercial uses, especially retail food establishments such as small markets, green groceries, and coffee shops, are to be encouraged. I guess I just have a general question here about, is it planning staff's belief that a land use policy can stop and turn around a fundamental economic trend? I mean, certainly, even as recently as when I first came to Santa Barbara, when I was a college student here, there were more corner markets. There were little stationary stores instead of staples. But I think you can see, if you were to look, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm sure if you looked from the beginning of the 20th century till now, the tendency has been away from tiny retail establishments to larger establishments that have more variety and lower prices. So I'm just trying to get a sense here. Does staff believe that there's a land use policy that's going to turn that trend around?
Can I answer that? Madam Mayor, Councilman Francisco, this is something that we heard strongly from the community at the workshops, that they were very interested in corner markets as part of the neighborhood planning process. This was very loud and clear. We heard from them. And our feeling is that we have those same kind of reservations that you do. Is that an economically viable policy to be promoting? We feel like this is something that needs to be studied and would be ideal to look at the economics of it. But clearly, it's something that the community is interested in, both preserving what we have and encouraging those kind of markets.
Madam Mayor, I'd just like to add again, the economic cycles that I've experienced through my career as a planner have included boom and bust periods, and the city of Santa Barbara has already an eclectic mix of uses throughout many of the neighborhoods, where there are buildings, existing buildings that were once corner stores, were once small retailers and dry cleaning shops and things. And I find that the city's land use and zoning policies, standards, and practices, it is what we can do to affect the ultimate result in the community in terms of what land uses are there. Not alone. The economics play a huge role in it. But this is a land use planning effort, and this is the responsibility and authority that the city has in terms of shaping communities and where the land uses are and what the visions for the neighborhoods are. So I can tell you, I can think of a couple corner stores or small neighborhoods serving businesses that would have gone in to different places around our community to serve the residents there if our zoning was more permissive than it is. I think our zoning is all about getting rid of that old carpet store or corner store that used to be on Bath Street. When people come in now, we're like, oh, no. You know, this has been closed for over a year. You can't really do that. Where's your parking? So it has an influence. It doesn't override economic and other real-world considerations, but it's a factor in the equation.
Okay, I see what you mean. And finally, I'd like to look a little bit at the circulation policies. This is on page 58 and 59. My first question concerns policy C3. Give bike lanes designated in the bicycle master plan a priority over curbside residential parking. Do you have numbers, or are you going to have numbers on how many residential parking spaces would be eliminated by implementing that policy?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Francisco, that would be something that we'd have to consider in the environmental impact report.
Okay.
And the way just so you know, the way we would go about that is we would take the bike lanes that are proposed in the master plan, and then we'd look at the places they touch residential neighborhoods.
Right. Okay. Policy C8 on excess motor vehicle capacity. Could you give me an idea of how excess motor vehicle capacity is determined?
It's pretty simple. It means that if the congestion is not going to increase beyond our thresholds, that would mean that there's excess capacity, and that's in accounting for all the build out for the city. In other words, in the future. A good example of that is the Shoreline Drive project, where there were 4 lanes of traffic that were largely unnecessary, and we did not increase the congestion of the road, which again is a very low bar for the city. We don't tolerate the congestion level, but we were able to provide a new park along the waterfront instead, without increasing the wait times for motorists.
Okay. On the next page, policy C14, the downtown parking requirements. Update the boundary of the delineated area of the central business district to include more of the commercial area. Is the intent there that more businesses would be served by the existing downtown parking infrastructure, the parking garages? And if so, would they be paying into that?
No, actually, this does not affect what's called the PBIA for downtown. What this impacts is the delineated area that determines the parking standard. And what's happened over time as the commercial area has grown, where when that line was created, there were a lot of homes within the area, and now they converted to businesses. And we find that particularly over in the upper east northerly quadrant, northeast quadrant. Victoria and Anacapa, where there's commercial district, but across the street the parking requirement is radically different.
Okay. I think those are all my questions for now. Thank you very much.
I'll leave it. Okay. We have a lot of people who'd like to speak. Let's do some of them, and then we're going to take a quick break and then do the rest. So thank you for being so patient and good. Oh, you have a question too? Mr. Horton. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't notice that.
I have a question concerning page 15, policy drivers, and it's I guess a macroeconomic question that there's like one small paragraph which addresses the issues, and I think that Mr. Francisco and a couple of the others have kind of dwelled on this a little bit. And my question is, while this document was written and during all the work that our planning staff did, the economics of the whole country has taken a rather significant change. It's referred to here, but I wonder if you've really taken into consideration. I follow the financial markets a little bit, and I don't think that things are likely to ever be the same as they were 5 years ago, for example. Another thing is our redevelopment agency is phasing out soon, and in fact, the bonding capacity of that RDA is already finished. So, was this written with the idea that the economics would be basically the same in the future in terms of people wanting to invest money and things like that? Because I believe that would be a concern of mine unless you have really made some significant changes, because I don't think the investment future will be the same maybe ever again.
Madam Mayor, Councilman Horton, we couldn't agree more, and I think that's why we're undergoing the economic study at this time, and part of that study will look at the economic setting, what what our situation was 20 years ago, what it is today, what's changed, what implications does that have? And then specifically what we're going to focus on are construction development. What does it mean if we're going to have smaller units? Is that viable? If we're going to promote housing incentives, how can we do that? So that's exactly, I think you really hit it on the head. These are changing times, and we want to make sure that that's reflected in these policies and that in a timely way.
Okay, Mr. House.
Maybe I just got one question. I don't know if it's procedural or just this question of where this might be studied. And from a basic definition, I hear the word residential growth or capacity or whatever, but the number of units for study being spoken about. And my question goes to what seems to be maybe a misunderstanding that residential growth is the same thing as population growth. In other words, we talk about jobs, housing imbalance, we talk about the supply of housing, affordable housing, whatever. And my observation has been that over the last 30 or 40 years, we've had a pretty steady increment of growth on an annual basis in a population way, not housing. And that there's been a growing gap between the housing that's been provided locally and the population. And so the resulting two things that I want to ask you about is that there's some level of substandard housing, meaning that families are doubling or tripling up in single-family neighborhoods. Apartments are being, rooms are being rented out for much more capacity than they're really designed for. And the other side of that is that a whole segment of our population is being more displaced and having to travel a longer distance to get here. So the two pieces of the question are, first of all, where is that described as a phenomenon? And secondly, how is it studied? I mean, at what point do we, in the process, do we determine what's a level of substandard housing that's acceptable to the community? And or at what point do we describe the level of displacement of our population that would be considered acceptable as we look forward to the future?
Please.
Madam Mayor and Councilmember House, the one main piece of this Plan Santa Barbara process is the updating of our housing element. And the housing element has quite a bit of discussion about community demographics, population, people per household, population income, and so forth. The last time we updated our housing element, approximately 5 years ago, we had the benefit of a new census data. And so this current housing element has the most recent information that we have. We are not going to have a new full new census data for this update that we're underway with right now. However, that doesn't mean that we don't look at the question and try to gain any additional information, as there are ongoing community surveys. The American Community Survey is an effort, I think, on the part of the federal government and local governments to try to get more up-to-date information. But the part of the question of where this information would be, primarily it is contained in our housing element, and we will be holding hearings and review and discussion with the Planning Commission about updating that housing element. We've also thought about the whole general plan introduction itself and how important community demographics and economics and who we are is important beyond just the housing component of the housing element or the general plan. So we're actually looking to beef up an introductory section in the general plan. So that's where it'll be contained. Now, the assessment of levels of substandard housing programs to address those issues, again, that's more of a focus in the housing element. Mm-hmm. And in the next year, we will be holding, as I mentioned, community discussion, and John Ledbetter has mentioned a couple times, too, the economic study looking at some of our housing trends and conditions and then opportunities. Our housing element does have a number of policies already oriented towards managing the substandard housing issue. And we look to our building safety program and other things. The gentrification issue, the persons per household and the income level, I don't really feel that our housing element updates the last couple cycles have addressed that quite head on, perhaps the way we will this time.
Does CEQA require that we look into those things during the environmental review part of the process?
Well, possibly to the degree that our land use or housing policies would have some sort of direct effect on environmental justice or equity. It's a new area of CEQA. Relatively new. We don't have an EIR that fully examines that, but I'm not sure how direct. Usually when I hear that,
a little bit to the scope. The question that we've heard over and again, that housing is not just a local phenomenon, that it's regional in its nature.
Yes.
So I guess my question really more goes to when we do the studies of housing and its impacts on these various levels that you've talked about, do we consider the impacts on, say, adjoining communities of our displacing our population, or do we also, maybe even in the local segment, do we look at the effect of what level we're providing vis-a-vis the actual population growth and what that means in terms of either quality of life or environmental impacts at a local level? Does that get woven into or blended into this study?
It certainly can, and to the degree that this project is looking at regional housing issues, and again, the update of our housing element, we have a big section on regional, and that was a comment from the Planning Commission. They wanted to look at each one of these policy sections to see what were we saying about regional governance, and that is specifically called out, that issue of how do our land use decisions affect the region and the movement of workers. So since we're going to be studying this policy document, the answer is yes. We'll be studying the direction and the questions posed by this document.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, a little flag for me anyway. It's one of those things I am certainly
And
interested in.
maybe
I'm sure
I
we'll
can
hear
take a
others
moment
speak.
and at some point point that out to
Great.
you where
Thank
I
you very
think we
much.
added that.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, first speaker will be Fred Sweeney, and I'm going to set the clock here to count up from 0, and if you could, at 2 minutes, try to wrap up. I know you have a lot to say, but we want to hear it. And we received a letter from you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Mayor, Council. My name is Fred Sweeney. I'm a resident of the Upper East, and I'm here representing, as a facilitator, the Upper East Association. And if someone could go to the slide that shows the secondary units, please.
Yeah.
I'm not going to bother reading the entire letter to you. I'm sure you've had time to look at it. But I wanted to share with you a couple of points that the Upper East Association has started to take on. I guess, first of all, you can see where the term secondary dwelling units encouraged. You can see where that term is sitting on the map. The sleeping Upper East Side has finally awoken, and the association, in fact, at its last meeting, has now a dozen-plus new board members as a result of looking at that particular document, I think. And in essence, the important part of the letter that was given to you was the fact that the residents of the Upper East feel very strongly that the secondary unit ordinance that's now in place remains in place. We think that any encouragement to perhaps devalue that ordinance, so to speak, would tend to increase the density in the Upper East area, particularly in the single-family parcels. If one takes a look at the detailed parcel map of the Upper East, particularly from Valerio Street up through Constance, from State over to Laguna, you probably could identify at least 150, if not 200 parcels that are better than 10,000 square feet. And I know the ordinance says 7,000 square feet, that could in fact take secondary units. And the Upper East residents feel very strongly that implementation of that in its fullest extent would really change the character and nature of the Upper East Side. So the meeting we held, there was a lot of very strong opinion to that effect, and that's reflected in the letter. The second point I'd like to finish on is the boundary of the Upper East that's shown in the earlier documents that were provided by the city. The residents felt very strongly that the Rose Garden, Roosevelt School, and that area be included, and there was a map included along with a letter, that be included within the definition of the Upper East. And then there was a considerable amount of debate between what many folks perceived as the historical definition of the Upper East, which went down to Valerio Street, not Sola. And in our last meeting, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not the Upper East residents felt that inclusion of the parcels down to Sola Street was an important consideration in redefining what the Upper East is. And so the letter reflects that, also reflects the fact that we recognize there is a bungalow district that touches one edge of the historical definition of the Upper East. And so we wanted to convey that to you also. Just to let you know, in the next sequence of conversations that the Upper East Association is holding with its residents, we will sit down and discuss MOTA and try to understand what that means. Also try to understand what sustainability as a neighborhood means. Lots of folks don't quite have their arms around that yet, and so we want to try to take and really work on that. And then also in the works is a more definitive narrative on the definition of the Upper East. We're working on that currently. And in addition, a lot of folks are concerned about the edge conditions around the neighborhood as they touch other neighborhoods, particularly the Riviera and across State Street and down into downtown. So with that, I will thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing our dialogue with both the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Jan Atkins will be followed by Danny Kopis. And Danny, if you could sit up in front here, be ready to go. And then Tom Belay. All three of you. Whoever wants to go first, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Bloom and Council. My name is Danny Kopis. I'm president of the Coast Village Business Association. Thank you for having us before you. Nearly 3 years ago, our association embarked on a mission to create a vision plan for the Coast Village Road area. Design guidelines that would assist developers and the council for making decisions for the area. The council, in the summer of 2006, the City Council actually received this document. This was a document created from the input of association members during association meetings. In January of this year, we took it a step further, the association did, after seeing the community's active participation in issues facing the area. We recognized that the best document, the strongest document, would have input not just from our landowners and business owners, but from the community of Montecito in its entirety, residents included. With the helpful advice of Councilperson House, we established 2 town hall meetings to collect input from the community about ideals and concerns for the Coast Village area. You have now this completed document, this revised vision plan or design guidelines, if you will. Most of what you'll see you saw before, or the council saw before at that time. It is our request that the design guidelines and ideals within this document be incorporated into everything that we're talking about here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan Atkins, followed by Tom Belay. Oh, if you could come up to the front, it would be helpful, Jan. Yeah, just so we could save the time. Thanks. Hi, Tom.
Madam Mayor and council members, I just wanted to go over briefly some of the high points of these guidelines. These are really intended not to be taken as a letter, but as the broader intent of community input to your system. So we're really hoping that it's going to be possible to take the ideas of this or some of the ideas and mesh them into Plan Santa Barbara. I know on your map that you have us as a separate neighborhood. We would like to either be that neighborhood, but also like to see changes in the zoning ordinance to help support the specific elements that we're trying to cover. Basically, our goal is to preserve and protect and enhance the existing semi-rural environment of Coast Village Road. We think we're unique in the city in that it's really very much of a part of a semi-rural residential neighborhood around it, which is Montecito, and it's got a value of itself. It's the eastern gateway to the city. One of the concerns, or I should say the majority of the concerns that came out of our town hall meetings were to prevent overdevelopment, to limit the amount of traffic so it doesn't become an area that we need to have stoplights or traffic lights, and to have parking be integrated into the developments. Part of that came out of we asked questions of size, and the ordinance now allows 45 feet. Almost unanimously came out of the community that we wanted to limit it to be much lower. We gave them a very number of heights, and 30 feet came out as the average of what most people would like to see. They also said that it would be okay to have daylight basements on the south side of Coast Village Road, so that would not count against that height limit. There was also a lot of talk of FAR, floor area ratio. I know this has been discussed downtown, but specifically I think it would help a lot in this road, because we don't want to try and make a box that every building comes out the same height. We'd really like to see it where we have a height limit, but we also have varied development within that, and FAR I think would be a very valuable tool. So we're looking forward to working with the process and staying involved with it throughout the whole thing. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your work. Jan Atkins will be followed by Steve Cushman.
Good morning, Mayor Blum, City Council people, and staff. Again, we at Coast Village Business Association have spent several years working on the vision for solving community issues such as traffic and enhancing architectural ambiance on Coast Village Road and Circle. When Plan Santa Barbara became a reality and a vehicle for us to jump on to validate our vision plan, we sponsored our town halls in May, bringing the community of businesses, owners, and residents together on these issues. While the Plan Santa Barbara train is moving, we are jumping on, asking that you incorporate our plan with yours in the procession towards the completion of Santa Barbara's revised general plan. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you, Ms. Atkins. Thanks for your work, too. Steve Cushman will be followed by Gene Holmes.
Mayor Bloom, members of the council, Steve Cushman. I represent the Santa Barbara Chamber of Commerce. And, 20 years ago I came back to Santa Barbara and participated in this same process. And last night I said, wow, this is such a beautiful place. So I think this is what you do best. And I think this is a reflection of what you do best. This process is the highest level of discussion, community involvement, and you've created and will continue to create a wonderful place that we're all lucky to live in. I think from the Chamber's point of view, always, literally for 20 years, the highest priority has been housing. And I think intuitively we all realize that's a big issue. Traffic has always been number 2 for 20 years, and this year, guess what? The economy has emerged as number 1. So I know you're considering those things. I hope you keep in mind that 50% of this economy in Santa Barbara is driven by tourism, and education is probably the number 2 driver of the economy, and government is probably number 3. So how you get employees to fill those critical positions is, I think, a big factor in how you plan. We hope you keep the transfer of development rights. We think that's a good tool for you to use. We think it's been an effective tool that was used over the last 20 years, and we really don't see any reason to not have that tool at your disposal. And as you look at height limits, I think what occurred to me yesterday as I was talking to a group was at a time when kind of how work is done is changing, at a time when, when we're poised for the internet to create a whole new economy worldwide. We're talking about reducing the density downtown, a place where people can live, work, not have to get in their car, get all their entertainment, do all the things that we all love to do. And so we think the concept of reducing density, changing the height limit is not the right way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Gene Holmes, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break. Is Gene here? Oh. Guess what? We're all going to step out. So we'll take just about very, very short break. We'll have a quorum back here at about 25, 26 after. Thank you. Other council members in here? We want to get back. Usually you call a break and everybody leaves. I couldn't get anybody to go. Oh, well. No, this is really good, and good conversations going on out there, so thank you so much. We're going to reconvene the city council members too, city council meeting, and we have more people. I have Gene Holmes is the next person, followed by Holly Goldberg. And I have this note while Gene Holmes gets up here, Janet Graham She says she had to leave. She's with it, or she just wanted me to read this. From the Upper East Side Association, she said, I don't wish to speak, but support the Upper East Side Association statement. So that's good. Jean, followed by Holly Goldberg. Thank you. Okay, and we're cutting them off? Yeah. We really want to get through all the public comment, if we can, today, so we can really, think about it for Tuesday evening. So if we can do this quickly and well. Okay, Jean?
Hello. I am Jean Holmes, reading a statement for the Allied Neighborhoods Association. Unfortunately, the president, Judy Arias, cannot be here today. Allied believes the policy preferences document is not balanced. We had hoped at the beginning of Plan Santa Barbara that the policies that came out of the process would reflect the desires of the general public. We believe the public has a preference for maintaining Santa Barbara's unique characteristics and not for a blanket adoption of concepts taken from elsewhere. We find that many of the proposed land use policies, based on the MOTA concept, do not reflect our comments or many other comments presented by the public at the workshops and hearings. We will list some specific problems Allied has with policies related to MOTA. While we all understand the general meaning of this term, that is, increased density along transit corridors, the devil is in the details. If this means refocusing the density that is allowed by existing zoning to a different location, we have no quarrel. If it means adding density to the density that zoning already allows, we have a problem. There are already enough units in the existing zoning to take care of the number of new units expected to be built and to allow for RHNA as well. Also, we do not believe that in a community like Santa Barbara, people will get out of their cars simply because alternative transit is available. This is especially true for the occupants of high-end condos. While it is an interesting theory, we believe the jury is still out on whether they will significantly cut down on congestion in this town. We note that without subsidies, the housing along transit corridors will not be affordable to the majority of our workers who need housing. The proposal for future increases in granny units has generated very heavy concern in the neighborhoods. For example, the Mesa area has topographic constraints, and Hidden Valley has access and egress problems. We think that consideration needs to be given to the individual characteristics of the various areas. On commercial, Allied believes that all new non-residential square footage should be lumped together, and the total should be no more than 1.5 million square feet. We believe the city needs also to analyze an alternative that would couple 1 million square feet of commercial with various housing numbers in order to see if this is a feasible way to improve the jobs housing balance. And lastly, the maps need to be accurate. We have found discrepancies between the high fire zones in the conditions, trends, and issues map and the revised policy preferences map. Allied has earlier submitted more extensive comments to you and to staff. If you have any questions about them, please contact our President, Judy Arias. Thank you for consideration of our comments.
Thank you very much. Holly Goldberg will be followed by Sharon Brunette.
Thank you. My name is Holly Goldberg, and I am speaking on behalf of Eileen Monahan, Manager of Office of Early Care and Education, First 5, Santa Barbara County. She prepared a letter on her behalf since she wasn't able to be here, so I'm going to read the letter. I strongly urge you to consider every opportunity at this point in the Santa Barbara City General Plan process to include language and provisions for the development of child care into the General Plan. The Santa Barbara City Council members, as a body and individually, have been true champions of child care. Including child care language in the city's general plan is a powerful tool for you to put your values into action and encourage the development of child care within the community in order to support local residents and businesses. Having gone through the permitting process with family child care and center operators, I know there is more we can do to encourage this fundamental service for our children and families. Planning for childcare is critical in creating an integrated community. Such an essential service should be carefully thought about and included in discussions. It's vital when looking at circulation patterns, for instance, to consider where parents will be bringing their children before and after work. By reducing the proximity of childcare to business centers, and thus to their working parents, you can actually strengthen families by enabling the parents access to their children during the day. In the draft policy preferences, there are many areas where including childcare language can be included. Here are some of my suggestions. Number 1, energy and climate change section. Include childcare in the second bullet, page 14, with affordable housing as additional job creation without sufficient childcare will result in congestion and traffic. Similarly, in the third bullet, include childcare along transit corridors. Number 2, economic and fiscal health, page 15. Include childcare in the second paragraph along with affordable housing. Number 3, sustainability, principles, and equity. Page 19, include childcare in the first bullet. Number 4, land use and growth management. Page 27, include childcare in the list of resources. And number 5, growth management policies. Page 28, LG2, exclude childcare from the non-residential limits. Number 6, land use policies. Page 29, LG9, include childcare in A, B, and C, and LG11. Number 7, neighborhood policy, page 32, include childcare as a separate item. Number 8, community design policies, include childcare as an item, encourage safe and affordable, high-quality childcare that is available and accessible to all economic segments of the community. And lastly, number 9, housing, adding item about including childcare in housing developments. The City of Santa Barbara has a critical shortage of childcare spaces. For every licensed space in the city, there are 3 children of working families needing that space. The general plan is our opportunity to change this ratio to encourage more childcare to be developed. Growth in the childcare industry has been slow and difficult. Childcare businesses, which generally operate with little to no profit margins, are struggling to staff their programs and maintain facilities to meet the increasing demand for care. The childcare industry in Santa Barbara does not have the resources nor the expertise to ensure that families have available quality care that is needed for a community to thrive. Throughout California, a radical shift in public consciousness around childcare is taking place. Cities are no longer viewing childcare as a public or recreational service. Instead, the childcare industry is being realized as an essential service or social infrastructure like transportation, public works, affordable housing, and higher education. All these elements are necessary and valuable pieces of a community's economic and social well-being. And according to national studies, each dollar spent on quality childcare can save $7 to $17 in future spending on criminal justice, welfare, and social services. Childcare is like roads. Parents need both to get to work. Eileen is available for further discussion about this.
Okay.
So
you want to leave that? Yeah. I started to take notes and realized you have copies for us, so that's fine. Good. Thank you very much. Sharon Brownette will be followed by Bill Marks. Is Sharon here? Uh-oh. I don't see Sharon, so we'll go with Bill. And Sharon just says that she supports the Upper East Side, too. But she wants accommodations for parking to be added if we add housing. Okay, Bill, you'll be followed by Courtney Diaz. Hi.
Madam Mayor and council members, I am Bill Marks, speaking as a 44-year resident of East San Roque and avid reader of the draft policy preferences through several editions. While I understand that, to quote page 20, for most resources, their capacity to support a population is not a fixed amount in absolute terms, and that conservation strategies, technological advances, alternative energy sources, and changes in resource costs may create greater efficiency. I would caution against the assumption that we can plan for a sustainable future using such a very elastic definition of available resources. For example, factors like technological advances and changes in resource costs can be highly unpredictable. Throughout the current draft, there is the basic assumption that Santa Barbara needs sufficient growth to propel a steady economy, end quote. Which statement reminds me of the first rule for staying on your bicycle: keep pedaling. There are times, however, when it might be better to hop off the bike and figure out where you are and where you're going. Specifically, we need to understand the balance between our existing resources and our existing population. For example, we seem to have exceeded the carrying capacity of our major thoroughfares. The bullet train is a welcome prospect, but the distance between Highway 101 and the Pacific Ocean is likely to get narrower rather than wider, despite our ability to engage in magical thinking. We live, move, and have our being in a narrow strip between the mountains and the sea. And there it is. Right? And with permanent restraints on our ability to expand beyond our natural limitations. Throughout the draft, a focus on zoning and the amount of units, and this has been noted by Council Member House, throughout the draft, a focus on zoning and the amount of units of commercial and residential space to be accommodated in Plan Santa Barbara tends to obscure the number of additional residents that we are talking about and how sustainability will be affected by their per capita demand on both resources and all sorts of services. It is my hope, therefore, that the upcoming EIR will serve to ground Plan Santa Barbara in a more concrete and realistic view of what degree and kind of growth we need to propel a steady economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Courtney Dietz, followed by Mary Louise Days. Is Mary Louise here? She was. Oh, okay. There she is. Mary Louise can come up. Thank you. Courtney.
Madam Mayor and Council, my name is Courtney Dietz, and I'm the project director for Santa Barbara Walks, which is a project of COAST, the Coalition for Sustainable Transportation. And as someone working to improve pedestrian safety, infrastructure, and culture, I'm encouraged to see that in the first paragraph in the Vision for a Sustainable Santa Barbara that walkability is identified as, quote, an intrinsic character of urban life. Santa Barbara Walks supports many of the goals and objectives as they pertain to pedestrians, but seeks to highlight a few of these policies for encouragement. In the interest of time, I'm sort of combining LG9 and LG15. The concepts of MODA and sustainable neighborhood plans are essential for a sustainable future in Santa Barbara, and the design is appropriate considering at least 1/4 of all trips are under a mile, and almost 3/4 of those trips are currently made by car. Santa Barbara Walk supports higher densities along our transit corridors, making it easier for people to potentially work, live, shop, and play, all without having to rely on their cars. We appreciate the recognition that a holistic approach is necessary, for people need to have places to buy groceries and do general business accessible within walking and biking distance of their homes. Thus, the importance of the neighborhood-serving commercial and community services that have been proposed. As we can see from existing circumstances, neighborhoods lacking these aspects do not enable modes other than personal cars, which many of us are actually trying to move away from. And I wanted to add on a personal note that as a young professional in this community, these types of ideas really do support my personal lifestyle and living choices. Moving on to circulation, C2, high-quality pedestrian crossings are essential, and we would propose taking a more regional approach as opposed to intersection by intersection to develop pedestrian corridors specifically in the downtown areas. There's a significant lack of marked pedestrian crossings outside of the State Street area. If we are encouraging multimodal use, we must continue to create and connect the corridors for pedestrians as we do for all other modes, especially considering the implementation of MODA, which will add more people to already dense areas. C8 seems a little bit of a given to me that excess capacity should be used to accommodate all users whenever possible. C9, car-free zones. This is long overdue way to promote walking as well as give pedestrians a destination. Car-free zones support walking safety and culture by creating spaces that prioritize pedestrians and encourage interaction. And finally, C10 refers to vehicle speeds, and this cannot be stressed enough. The current method for establishing speed limits is antiquated and I think inappropriate. We must consider street design, adjacent land use, and mix of transportation mode usage, keeping in mind that the mode share may actually likely shift towards the 50-50 that's proposed if more of our streets better accommodated all users. The current system encourages speed of motorists, which decreases pedestrian safety and usability and must be redesigned, again, especially with the thought of increased density by MODA. I appreciate all the effort that's been made by all the staff and all the public, and it's encouraging to see so many of us passionately come out and support these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, and we have your letter that you gave us. I have Betsy Kramer first. Is that what you wanted to do on this? Betsy, oh, you're Betsy. Who knew? Betsy Kramer, followed by Paul Hernati, and then Mary Louise Days. Is that okay? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Well, hi,
Betsy
Betsy
had to leave and asked me to make her statement on behalf of the Citizens Planning. It says, "Good morning. And
It is.
it's good morning, Madam Mayor and council members. Citizens Planning Association's General Plan Update Committee has reviewed the latest policy preferences document that you are considering today and next Tuesday. In general, we welcome those policy preferences which promote living within our resources well into the foreseeable future and also show credible promise to improve our jobs housing balance. By contrast, we hope that policy preferences adverse to those overarching goals will be modified or abandoned in subsequent phases of the planned Santa Barbara process. In 3 brief statements, 3 of us from the Commission will be addressing the 3 clusters of topics. 1, commercial and residential growth. 2, environmental sustainability and public health. And 3, historical and aesthetic resources and their impact on economic sustainability. We will also submit a longer written version of our views before next week's deliberation by City Council. 1. Non-residential and residential growth. Almost any non-residential growth would increase the number of commuting employees, and the city's commuting workforce would be further increased by the service needs of those purchasing newly built market-rate housing. Therefore, we urge that the existing Measure E restrictions be renewed with enhanced vigor so that non-residential growth is capped at a grand total of 1.5 million square feet, including all relevant categories, and that residential growth be capped at 40,005 units and be geared to affordable housing to the greatest extent feasible. As a significant incentive for the production of housing affordable to low, moderate, and middle-income workers, we recommend that current density standards be raised only for developments with 100% rental or resale-restricted affordable units. For developments with less community benefit, we don't support the weakening of the current density and parking requirements in any of the commercial or residential zones. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Hernati, followed by Mary Louise Days.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and also good afternoon, members of the Council. I am the second of 3 speakers, and my topic is environmental sustainability and public health. We will, of course, expand on this in our written statement. But as far as this huge topic is concerned, today I will only speak about one selected aspect of it. We are pleased with the proposed policy that calls for a 500-foot setback from Highway 101 and for funding a program to monitor emission levels and identify a more refined setback line. This is ER 12. But we remain concerned about the lack of site-specific monitoring in those parts of the proposed mobility-oriented development area which lie further away from the highway. The siting of residential buildings near heavy stop-and-go traffic should not be advocated on the assumption that increasing urban density would decrease air pollution. To the contrary, and I quote from Urban Sprawl and Public Health, a book co-authored by 3 prominent environmental scientists, Howard Fromkin, Lawrence Frank, and Richard Jackson, pages 76-77. On a very localized scale, alongside a street in a particular neighborhood, greater traffic density could increase exposure to pollutant, especially particulate matter and air toxics. One study found that people who live near busy streets, defined as carrying more than 10,000 vehicles per day, were exposed to 2 to 3-fold higher levels of black smoke, a measure of particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and carbon monoxide, compared to people who live near a less busy street. Of course, as you know, Upper State Street carries over 30,000, not just the 10,000 that mentioned there. And I would like to stress before I read my last paragraph that CPA is not saying in any sense that, you know, you should try to keep something like 500 feet or even perhaps 200 feet away from those busy streets. What we are really after is to determine what the situation is like and then have proper setbacks and open space so that the air pollution can dissipate before it reaches the lungs of children and other sensitive receptors. So my last paragraph, given the proven impact of traffic-generated air pollution on public health, and especially on the respiratory organs of children and the elderly, a responsible land use plan for our downtown and other commercial areas must include the monitoring of their air quality so that the safe distance of residential developments from particular traffic corridors can be established. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mary Louise Days.
Thank you. I'm Mary Louise Days, presenting the last part of the CPA's committee comments, and we appreciate the attention paid to the booklet which we prepared and presented to the city last spring. On page 50 of the preferences report, item CH1 should be dropped in our opinion. It calls for adjusting the boundaries of the El Pueblo Viejo Landmark District. The boundaries of the district are included in the city charter now. The intent of the boundaries is not only to protect existing historic resources, but to continue the existence of Santa Barbara's famed architectural styles, the styles that relate directly to our heritage. The district assures that the historic character of Santa Barbara is maintained in the downtown, waterfront, and mission areas, with higher standards of adherence to the city's unique neocolonial Spanish and California building styles. There is no need for a different downtown design district. We are disappointed by the lack of detail in the policies proposed for the appreciation and preservation of historical and archaeological, prehistoric and historic archaeological resources. Santa Barbara has a rich historic legacy. Current goals and policies call for its protection and preservation. Any new ones should be at least as strong and elaborate on what is already outlined in existing documents. Likewise, the proposed policies concerning aesthetics and visual resources take good steps toward worthy goals without sufficient clarification of significant details. It should be explicitly stated, for example, that new developments shall preserve public scenic views. They should also maintain, or if possible, enhance the existing degree of openness, naturalness, and relative lack of congestion. Our city's beauty and attractive historic legacy are significant for more than purely aesthetic reasons. They contribute significantly to Santa Barbara's financial health as well. For example, to retain revenues stemming from tourism and retirement income, the city must remain competitive with other attractive locations by protecting and enhancing its special qualities. Similarly, we oppose any blanket lowering of the current on-site parking standards, in part because parking shortage in commercial areas would result in decreased sales tax revenues due to increased out-of-town and internet shopping. Last but not least, public safety is another important consideration for maintaining Santa Barbara's prestige as an attractive tourist and retirement destination. We recommend that the EIR explore whether our police and fire departments are adequately staffed and equipped for a growing city whose daytime population, local residents plus commuters and tourists, is significantly larger than the 90,000 plus people who actually live here. We thank you for consideration of our concerns.
Okay, thank you very much. Trish Allen will be followed by Connie Hanna. Trish left, okay. Connie Hanna will be followed by Susan Elledge. There you go.
I'm Connie Hanna, speaking for the Sustainable Communities Committee of the League of Women Voters. We have sent you a letter that I hope you've had a chance to read, and 5 members of that committee are present today. We know how much hard work and public input has gone into the policy preferences document, but we are concerned about which parts of the public input have found their way into the plan and which may have been omitted. We think that members of the public who have no financial interest in the outcome should be given further consideration. We have welcomed sections on historic resources and sustainability because we agree that they're going to be important for the city's future. We want to point out, however, that there is clearly disagreement about which policies are going to be sustainable and which are not. We do not believe that increasing the density of the downtown is going to be sustainable within any foreseeable resources. The League agrees with several planning commissioners that all elements of the non-residential growth ought to be included in the 1 or 1.5 million in the project. Otherwise, too much will be permitted and worsen the jobs housing imbalance. We agree that the present TEDR credit should be removed and variable density should be amended. We strongly oppose any plan to transfer resource demands from one property to another because all our resources are being strained now. The city is already zoned to permit 7,000 to 9,000 units, which is far more than our resources could ever support. Why then, on page 30 about MODA, is there a proposal to increase density? And if the market can only build expensive units, which is what we see, then why should we build more of them? They do nothing to solve our housing problems, and in fact, they compound them by requiring more service workers all the time. We ask you to look closely at the MODA proposals and scale them back so we don't aggravate our present lack of affordable housing. We also support Alternative 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan Elledge, followed by Joan Livingston.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. Suzanne Elledge. I'm coming to you today with the perspective of a 30-year resident and also the owner of a local land use consulting company. We represent roughly 100 projects at any given time, and a large percentage of those are within the city's boundaries. I wanted to, first of all, say that I really enjoyed participating in the workshops for Plan Santa Barbara. They were well attended. I was impressed so much. I'm so proud of our community. The passion that everyone has for it. And there was a surprising, and I think other people have spoken to this, there was a surprising amount of consensus on the direction we should go, what our goals and objectives should be. And that was impressive to me. Of course, the differences come in how we get there. And I did have a couple of comments about nuts and bolts. And actually, my concerns have been somewhat reduced based on the discussion that you've had today with staff on those nuts and bolts items. So let me just weigh in on them. The first had to do with TEDR. As the planning commissioners indicated, this was a late discussion, wasn't a lot of public input about it. I think it's really important to preserve. One of the commissioners mentioned traffic credits going back 20 years. I don't think that was the case. I think you should talk to staff about it. That is not a typical thing that CEQA would allow. Excuse me. Normally, a use that's discontinued for a year, you would not be able to carry forward credits like that. So I think that should be explored. I think it's a useful tool. It hasn't been abused, and it serves a purpose. I think that we have seen additional mixed-use projects come forward as a result, and I don't think it should be taken away. I also had a concern, and this is what was discussed a little bit more earlier, about the no project alternatives, no project alternative having a 28-unit
2,800
cap, and I question that, and I question the assumption there that we would just carry forward our historic growth rate in looking at the no project alternative. I think if we are able to mix and match, as Council Member Williams discussed, and look at a higher level of residential growth, with a lower level of commercial growth. If we can do that when we get to the end, then I think the EIR will have done its job. But I would hate to think that we would carry forward our past growth rate with respect to residential when we have a deficit now, when we have a jobs housing imbalance now, we don't have a crystal ball about the future and whether we're going to do a better job of incentivizing residential growth. So I had a concern about that, but I think you've gotten to it, and I hope we certainly do address it in a different way than maybe was perceived when everybody first read this. A little bit off topic, but I'm going to take the opportunity because I have the microphone. I just want to compliment you and the staff with your quick response with respect to the T-Fire. I'm really impressed with the structure that's been put in place to help the applicants get through that process in an expeditious manner. And the other topic is happy holidays. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're learning from our mistakes. I think we did a great job too, but you have to evaluate, and it's good. Joan Livingston, followed by Eva Inbar.
Madam Mayor, fellow council members, Joan Livingston, and I am speaking now as a resident of the Upper East, so you have to change gears. I used to be the Great West Side spokesperson, but now my interests are in the Upper East. And I want to flesh out a little bit about our last meeting because I think it's a trend. I want to underscore that there is a growing gap between the perceptions that we're hearing today that the community has bought in, there's buy-in on all of the drivers of the general plan, when in fact, as Fred Sweeney mentioned, the Upper East is just starting to wake up, and I think that you could apply that probably to the rest of the community. I will refer you back to the poll that the city commissioned back in August, where they surveyed 400 residents to ask their perceptions, and it was listed in one of the documents affirming the direction of the general plan. To me, the only thing valid about that poll is only 7% of the respondents said they knew anything about the general plan. That was 28 people out of 400. Yet we're being told that it reinforces the direction the city is going. 256 people said they didn't know anything. And this is in August. This is after a year of hearings. I would say the same thing was happening on the Upper East. Our first meetings, we had a few people who attended. We spread out a little bit. We got the word out a little bit more. At the last meeting, we had over 60 people that showed up, and phone calls from a number of people regretting that they weren't able to be there. Very enthusiastic response. Should we get together? Should we discuss these items more? Very enthusiastic. Was it 100%? No. There were a few people there that were in favor, and primarily it was over the secondary unit issue. So to say that the city has bought in and is encouraging second units would be a disconnect between what's happening on the Upper East right now. So 60 people came out this night. Probably 55 of them voted overwhelmingly loudly that they just don't want changes. When asked, what do we want to look like 30 years from now, most people said the way we looked 30 years ago. So is the Upper East asking for special treatment? Perhaps so, because it is a special district. If you look between MODA and the secondary dwelling encouragement, you basically carved and diced up the Upper East beyond recognition. It's a uniquely historic area because at one time, you all know that State Street ended, and so it became a very lovely, gracious, large lot residential area because it was the end of the city. State Street going through doesn't really change the character of that neighborhood. Yet MODA is treating it as if it's just one more street in Santa Barbara. But it isn't. It's got a very historic neighborhood, a very historic feel, and it's really well loved. Even when I didn't live there, I loved that area. And now that I feel lucky enough to be a resident there, I can see how important it is to protect it. Every time I go past Pearl Chase's house on the way down Anacapa Street, I'm thinking, she made Santa Barbara what it is because she knew how to say no. And I think this is what we are saying in the Upper East right now. We're saying no to the second units, which isn't to say, we know that the granting unit, the statewide ordinance, the way it is right now. So we're really saying no to changes. We live with what we have up there, but we would prefer the no project, no changes in that. And then also, I think it's really important to recognize the inherent contradiction saying we've lost affordable housing. At the same time, we're saying illegal units are increasing. It's exactly the same thing. So we do need to have a wider discussion about illegal units well outside of the general plan, because they are here. They're part of who our housing numbers are. They're part of how we distribute housing in Santa Barbara, and we need to have a wider discussion about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Eva Inbar, followed by Debbie Cox-Bealton. Yes.
The secondary dwelling unit locations, I'm looking at the map where it says, because I'm going back to Mr. Williams' question, when it says it's allowed, it means that is no change of current policies, right? Because the map says secondary dwelling units encouraged. I'm seeing west of State Street, not east of State Street, which tells me that's in the Oak Park neighborhood, not the Upper East neighborhood. No,
you're wrong.
Oh, there it is. I was looking at the.
Yeah, you're
that's
looking at the
Garden
purple
Street.
line, yeah.
That's purple line's Garden Street,
Yeah.
not State. Thank you. Never mind. Never mind.
No, it's good you asked. You got it straightened out. Good. Eva Inbar will be followed by Debbie Cox-Bealton.
I think it's good afternoon by now. Good afternoon, Madam. Yeah, I'm sorry, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. I'm Eva Inbar, President of COAST, Coalition for Sustainable Transportation. We did write you a letter. I hope you all had a chance to read that. I do not wish to repeat everything that's in the letter. You'll be pleased to hear. Just draw your attention to one or two things. The concept of MODA that was just discussed again, that is very intriguing. We do support it. We think it's a very good idea, and we do support the holistic approach that it provides to land use and transportation. And we believe it can be handled in such a way, the devil will be in the details, of course. It can be handled in such a way to respect neighborhoods that are really unique and beautiful. And I love the Upper East Side neighborhood as much as anybody, although I do not live there. So, yeah, we do look forward to helping the city flesh that out more, and I think there's a lot more detailed work to be done, especially in the parking requirements, abolishing some of the very onerous parking requirements, maybe looking at maximum parking requirements rather than minimum parking requirements. So there's all sorts of things that still can be worked out. And also vehicle speeds, that's what Courtney mentioned, that is just crucial. And finding a way to opt out of a system that currently forces us to raise those speed limits, that takes away that local control and just forces us into a mechanism where we really don't want to be. That is, I think, crucial as well. So those are some of the things that we do look forward to working with the city with in the future. And thank you very much for all the good work. I think it's been excellent.
Good. And thank you for your letter. Debbie Cox-Bealton, followed by Brian Cornell.
Good morning, Madam Mayor, council members. My name is Debbie Cox-Bealton with the Coastal Housing Coalition. We too submitted a letter, which I will not repeat, but we did want to commend the city staff and the Planning Commission for their really hard work and ensuring that so much of the public was able to comment on the direction of this draft that we feel it represents. We're very supportive of the policy recommendations, and in particular the emphasis on making affordable housing for all income levels a priority. As an organization that represents thousands of local employees, I can tell you that we did a recent survey of local employees and were pleasantly surprised to find that 61% or 1,800 people told us that they would be willing to write a letter in support of workforce housing, and 25% or 700 of them said that they would come and speak in support of workforce housing. Now, of course, getting them here and writing those letters is a different question, but we were delighted that happened, and I think it does show that the support is there for those policies. Our letter touches on some of the specific policies that we support in trying to reach these goals, in particular the employer-sponsored housing incentives for those as well as the incentives for second units. The final thing I wanted to comment on this morning is just, again, the scope of the EIR, which actually Suzanne Elledge's comments largely mirrored mine. We had some concerns going into this about using the historical rate of growth as the standard by which we were going to grow into the future. And given the fact that we have this daunting jobs housing imbalance, we're concerned that that would not be the right standard to use going forward. So we're pleased to know that we're going to be able to look at alternatives, some of these getting additional housing alternatives at 4,500 and up to the 7,000 build out, at least studied to be part of the discussion moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Brian Cornell will be followed by Stephen Yates.
Madam Mayor, members of council, as an almost 30-year resident of Santa Barbara, I have to say that I am
immensely proud of the sustainability framework that you have here in this document. Change is good, and I think the change this document has to encourage the change. The MODA notion, I think, is excellent. The adaptive management piece of this is going to be critically important. As a former president of the ECP, and now as we enter our new economic times, we've got to think about the regional economic consequences of everything we do. You know, the piece in the document about the regional economic policies, I think, is very important because what we do affects Carpinteria and Goleta, Ventura, Lompoc, et cetera. Couple of points. First, on the housing and the jobs housing balance, we obviously have to continue to strive for that. It's not an easy thing to get our hands around because, as has been mentioned, we've got 12,000 or some people coming into work here, and in an ideal world, those folks, I believe, would be living closer to where they work. And so, again, a regional connection here to our whole discussion. Affordability. Affordable is mentioned over and over again in the document. I don't know that we've done as good a job in defining affordability. I think we've got to be creative about what is affordable. It's not just units that are subsidized. I think there's a lot of there's workforce units, there's ranges of affordability, but clearly we need to have smaller units and we need to create the housing that we need. And I completely agree with speakers before. We don't need large residence downtown. We need small, affordable residential units downtown. In that regard, relative to the sustainability principles, we've got to allow higher density. We're not going to get affordability in our housing where we need it downtown unless we recognize that the economic realities are going to force us to look at higher density solutions. Obviously, that has to be in the context of our historic protection, has to be in the context of appropriate size, bulk, and scale being still mandated, but we have to have flexible, higher density to create the incentives and the ability to get this housing. We need to have compact growth. Relative to TEDRs, I disagree with Commissioner White. I don't think it's outmoded. In fact, it may be part of MODA. Who knows? You know, that element has provided a very important component of flexibility that I think, because we don't know what the future is going to bring, we need to allow it to be kept in place. A couple of examples I thought about. One, we talk about historic. There may be a day when that big 5-story building next to El Paseo is determined could go somewhere else, and we get it away from that historic resource. Or another example is the National Guard thing that's up at Las Positas. I mean, that square footage, it would be great to move that somewhere else and expand McKenzie Park. But if we don't allow that flexibility, those buildings are going to remain in place. So don't get rid of that. Certainly it can be refined. And by the way, right now it doesn't allow any transfer of traffic trips. The resource piece of it was specifically excluded as part of Measure E, and that's fine. I think that we should probably maintain that. But allow property owners the ability to move square footage around. Finally, on the neighborhood policy, I think that is just an excellent piece of this. You know, this map that is in here, I think, doesn't truly reflect what our neighborhoods and our districts are, and I think that's a big piece of work. And maybe that's where the AIA or the APA or other groups can really help understand what are those real boundaries on the ground as far as defining those neighborhoods, and really create the resources and encourage those neighborhoods to do what the MESA group has done to really figure out what works for them. Schools is such an important component of defining what a neighborhood or a district is. I think each one almost has to have that piece of it, as well as the markets and whatnot has been mentioned. But that's an exciting piece of this, and I look forward to being a part.
Thank you. Thanks for all you've done so far. Stephen Yates will be followed by Detty Pikert. Oh, Stephen's on here, so Detty, come on up. Followed by April Palencia. I hope I did that right. Oh, there she is.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor. I'm Detty Pikert. I'm here representing myself, but also speaking on behalf of Santa Barbara for All, a coalition of environmentalists and planners and others who have worked to represent the views of this coalition as we go forward with the plan. I'm really happy to be here at this particular junction in the process to see that we're finally hitting this particular milestone, and I compliment staff and the Planning Commission that did an amazing job of pulling all these diverse opinions and ideas together to form a document that I think represents pretty cohesive consensus around many of these issues. But as we can see, there's still a lot of differences on the detail. And of course, as Steve Cushman says, that's what we do, that's what you do, that's what Santa Barbara does. We work together until we iron out all those things to arrive at the consensus that really works best for the community. I wanted to mention one thing that concerned me a little bit. Someone had mentioned that somehow the process had been hijacked by certain specific groups, and I just think that is just absolutely not true. I attended many of those workshops myself. I saw the vast diversity of opinion that was represented there. You can see it here today in this meeting, the diversity of opinion and the involvement of diverse elements in the community expressing their ideas and making sure that this document, in fact, does represent a consensus of opinion. Santa Barbara for All produced a brochure, a vision for Santa Barbara. You're familiar with it. I've got a few extra copies if anyone wants to see that. I think that many of the ideas and principles of sustainable community are represented here, and I've never yet heard anybody object to anything that's been written in this brochure. So I think there really is the possibility of arriving at that consensus. I want to just mention something that has been mentioned a couple of times before, and that's the transfer of existing development rights. I also agree that that's an important feature of Measure E, allowing the flexibility to transfer some of those square footages that may be lost as a result of economic forces that do away with certain commercial buildings or square footage. You want to have the flexibility to be able to replace them if the loss of those buildings results in a loss of economic vitality. So we want to maintain that economic vitality and have the flexibility to do it. I think the resource transfer is another aspect of that I hope you'll discuss in more detail, because I think it could be an important feature of maintaining that economic vitality in the downtown area. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit is the fact that, we're in the EIR, we're looking at these various alternatives, and of course one of the things that we're looking at is the policies of the past 20 years, where we are and what those patterns that occurred as a result of those policies. I would say that many of these policies had very good beneficial effects on the communities, no question about that. But there are also some effects that weren't so beneficial, and I think you just need to ask the 30,000 commuters who are unable to find housing in Santa Barbara whether those policies have worked in the case of providing the housing that's really needed. And of course, we all know what the impact on the environment and traffic congestion, et cetera, is of that particular failure. So finally, I would just say that, as we go forward, we may be facing a very different future than we had in the past 20 years. We all know that as a result of the economy, the environment, and all of these factors. And I think it's really, really important that our plan represents a clear understanding of the needs of the future. And I think we're definitely headed in the right direction, but I think we still have a lot of discussion ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. April Palencia, followed by Lisa Plowman.
You pronounced my name perfectly. Thank you.
Wow. I learned.
Hi, Madam Mayor, Council. I'm April Palencia, and today I'm representing the Sustainability Project. Just as a reminder, our mission is to inspire change in the built environment of our region that will improve the quality of life in harmony with nature for this and future generations. We believe the City General Plan has a critical role to play in helping our community become more sustainable and self-sufficient while adapting to the diminishing fossil fuel, water, and food resources and the ongoing effects of climate change. We're supportive and appreciative of the process, and we've mentioned several specific goals and policies that we recommend for Plan Santa Barbara in our letter dated September 26, 2007. We believe Plan Santa Barbara must manage growth over the next 20 years in a way that creates a better and more sustainable community. We need policies that will minimize or eliminate the impacts of the growth. Like Ms. Weiss mentioned, our housing need may or may not equal 2,800 units, and the EIR should reveal this. The EIR should provide some information to discuss the appropriate balance of all the various factors. Our community will continue to be affected by the changes around us. We are faced with diminishing fossil fuel, water, and food resources and the ongoing effects of climate change. By defining a reasonable amount of growth for our community through the EIR process and ensuring that this growth occurs in a sustainable fashion, we will successfully adapt to these changes and protect the present interests and the interests of our future generations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Palencia, would you please resend that letter you mentioned? That was from a long time ago, and I don't know that I still have it.
Yeah. Who should I address that to?
Yeah. Just send it to Mayor and to me, and I'll get it out there or whatever. Yeah, I don't have a copy either. That's why I was rifling through. Okay, Lisa Plowman will be followed by Alex Peugeot.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Lisa Plowman, and I'm representing Santa Barbara for All today. I know Debbie Pikert spoken on our behalf as well. I want to start with just saying that we've been involved in the process from the very beginning. Many of us not organized at that point when it really first started, but we have become organized as a group of concerned citizens. And we think that the process was a pretty great process, actually. It started with neighborhood meetings and moved into workshops that were held at the library and then into pretty thorough planning commission hearings. And I felt that there was a diversity of participants in that process and a diversity of views that were expressed. So I wanted to applaud staff and also the planning commission for expanding their public review process to include more time and more thorough analysis of the policies that were being presented. And I think the document has come a very long way, and we're by and large impressed with it. I want to cover three main issues today that we have some concerns about. First, we are very supportive of the MOTA policies. And I spoke, maybe it was a week or 2 weeks ago, about Building Height Initiative and talked a lot about sustainability, but we believe those policies actually go a long way in terms of keeping Santa Barbara and making Santa Barbara more sustainable as we move into the future. And it really allows us to focus housing in areas where people will have options on how they move around our community rather than many people being forced into their vehicles if they don't live nearby services or employment centers. Next, I want to talk a little bit about TEDR. And a lot of people have spoken about that today, and we're very supportive of maintaining that tool in the downtown area. I think it allows for revitalization efforts and enhances those abilities without actually ever increasing square footage. And I thought Brian Cornell made some excellent points with respect to that, and I won't go on about it. But I do think it came up because there were some questions about the overall commercial square footage that is allowed in the general plan, in the concepts that are going to be reviewed in the EIR. And if that's the case, let's talk about that, the total amount of commercial square footage, rather than a tool that allows us to move square footage around our community to more appropriate areas. And then I want to talk a little bit about the EIR project description. Today we've talked a lot about what our jobs housing balance is and the fact that we're at an imbalance where we have not provided sufficient housing for our employees in the community. And right now we have a project description that basically reiterates the past. It talks about a similar level of commercial growth and a similar level of residential growth. Well, we know that that policy approach did not get us to a place that we are happy about. We actually all agree that we need to provide more housing for our employees. So let's take this opportunity to correct that. Let's take this opportunity to increase the housing opportunities. And I know that Ms. Weiss has talked about whether or not the policies that are in this preferences report would actually support a higher level of housing, but I think they do. They create incentives for second units, and I I think those second units should be spread out throughout the community, not just in one particular neighborhood or two particular neighborhoods. And they talk about creating incentives for a greater number of smaller units in our downtown area. So there are policies there that actually help us to get to a higher level of housing, and I think that's really important. I do want to just say one thing about adaptive management. I think that's a great idea, but I also don't want to see it used as a way to bolster policies that would promote the same pattern of growth that we've seen in 20 years. So I think we can use that, but let's look at creating more housing for our community members. And then just the very last item is a lot of people comment on if we have more housing, that's just going to create a greater demand for resources. And I think that's not an issue to be dismissed. It's really important, and we all agree that we want to develop our community that's based on the resources that we have available. But I think MODA comes back into the discussion here when you talk about that, is if we put our housing in areas that are in downtown in condominiums, they use less resources than a single-family house. And so all of this stuff is really integrated when it comes right down to it. But I think it's just important to consider all of those issues and make sure that we're clear about what it is our policies are promoting for our future. And with that, I want to thank everybody and the opportunity to speak here and reiterate Suzanne Elledge's comment that happy holidays.
Thank you. Alex Peugeot. Oh, go ahead.
Madam Mayor, and
Followed by Gil Berry.
mainly just the remaining speakers, I have to give an apology to because I have to leave to take Jennifer to her surgeon down in Los Angeles. So I will watch the remainder of the public testimony.
Yeah, I know we're supposed to end in about 3 minutes, and I've got 6 more speakers, so we can do this.
Mayor Alex Peugeot, so I'll be brief. I will support the comments previously made by Lisa Plowman, and especially Mickey Flax on behalf of Santa Barbara for All. She wrote a letter, a long letter with comments. I support that. And also the letter written by Eva Inbar from Coast. I'd also like to recognize staff for the process, the inclusiveness. We talk about the regulars being part of the process. I hear that a lot, and especially today being a morning on a working day. Yes, you see the regulars, but I did see the outreach, very good outreach to Spanish speakers, younger people. We even had high school students on one of the meetings, were meetings in the neighborhoods. I really appreciate that. And when you talk about that this is not your mother's general plan, the whole concept of sustainability, the way your staff has defined it is very good, plus, of course, MODA and the sustainable neighborhood practices. And it is different from the way Goleta or the unincorporated areas of the Goleta Valley have done the general plan update. That's why it is not the same. Santa Barbara has assumed its urban responsibility as becoming the historic place at the center of the South Coast, and that is what this general plan reaffirms. It is not your mother's general plan. That's why that comment is. And then also we should talk a little bit about the granny units and how everybody wants change without changing. And I'm sorry if I take a minute, but it seems to be like this culture of denial. We live in a society that we don't see what we don't want to see. We do have at times an incredibly large undocumented workers population that give us our food, does the dirty work for us, makes the beds in the tourist industry and cooks our meals and so forth, and they don't exist. And then they live in illegal units that also don't exist. There are maybe 10 legal units in the last, since 92, 16 years. And perhaps as many as 10,000 illegal units. There's something nice about illegal units. There are 2 in my same block. The nice thing is that you don't see them. And they're the perfect tenants because nobody wants to make noise because otherwise they would be kicked out. So there's some beauty to that. So I want to really think about that. But if we have a housing shortage, and we do have one of the highest VMTs, vehicle miles travel, in the whole country and maybe in the whole world, Santa Barbara County, read those numbers. And we also are concerned about gentrification. Something has to change. So I will ask our neighbors in the Upper East Side and some other places that, we need to work together. We need to make a way to have this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Gil Berry will be followed by Kathy McCammon and then Ray Mabu.
Madam Mayor and council members, my name is Gil Berry. I'm a board member of Allied Neighborhoods Association. but right now I'm not speaking for all allied members. Many of us have attended the entire process, participated in all the meetings. We recognize that staff has worked hard and there's been adequate participation in the process. However, many of us who participated feel that this particular policy preference report before you well represents the staff preferred policy and it well represents the development community preferred policy, but many of us feel that it's not yet quite acceptable to many residents in the neighborhoods. This proposed policy preference, we believe, is partly based on a faulty premise that many feel that the residents of the neighborhood would trade off allowing high-density development in the commercial zones in exchange for not having big new housing projects occur in the neighborhoods. And that actually is a faulty premise because many of us feel that the majority do not want to increase the base maximum allowed density in units per acre in the commercial zone. Now, many of us have no problem at all with the number of units proposed if it were done under our existing maximum allowed density. Many of us could support this policy preference only if it were modified by going through it and removing every single mention that density will be increased and clarify that any density increase over the existing base density will only be allowed for affordable housing projects. And the reason for this is because our base density is our only form of growth control. And the existing density limits and the resulting population control is what made our city wonderful by keeping it smaller than it otherwise would be. And this proposed policy preference is unacceptable to many in the community because it calls for the maximum allowed density to be increased and focuses rather on type, location, size, and design, and not on the number of units or the density. Therefore, it is removing the growth control. And that growth control is assured that we only get the desired number of units. And without growth control, the number of units would not stay at 2,000, 2,500, 4,000, but would be based on what the development community wished to build up to the 6,500 allowed units. And if densities increased, it could be above 6,500. And the only thing that would hold it back would be the economy. And yes, we're in a recession, but the recession is going to end someday, and then we'll be back to a building boom. And if you think of 100 units built here per year, well, we have the capability of 6,500 new residential units in the commercial mixed-use areas under our existing density. So 100 units a year, that's 65 years of building under our existing density. Therefore, please revise the policy preference report to remove all mention that the base density will be increased. Now, many of us support the idea of a dual density or increasing density above the existing level for affordable housing, but not for just regular market projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy McCammon, followed by Ray Mahbub, and then Joyce McCullough.
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy McCammon, and I'm speaking here today for the League of Women Voters. MODA is, of course, one of our great concerns. It underlies many of the land use policies listed in the document before you. We believe that many of these policies are unrealistic and will not solve Santa Barbara's problems of needed affordable housing or reducing congestion. In fact, they have the potential for further increasing density and exacerbating all our problems. While League in general supports the principle of building housing close to transit corridors, we do not think that owners of million-dollar condos will forsake their car to ride the bus, and the people who would be more likely to use public transit cannot afford the housing. There is no policies that talk about addressing choice riders, those that have a choice between taking their car and transit. MODA was introduced late in the planned Santa Barbara process and did not have adequate discussion in the workshops. We don't think people fully understand what it means or its ramifications. We know this because several groups have said they want to know more about MODA, and some people just look at us and say, what is it? Many people will be surprised the city is encouraging more second units in these areas and reducing standards such as required parking. Many of the residential neighborhoods are already concerned about the number of cars parked on their streets. League is concerned about the emphasis on increasing second units throughout the city, when we all know there are numerous illegal units. We believe that these have impacts on water supply, parking, traffic, and other resources that need to be fully considered. We think that there needs to be a policy that states neighborhood characteristics need to be taken into consideration. One size does not fit all. We question why the plan suggests increasing density when the city's present zoning could accommodate 9,000 more dwelling units. That's what's left from the 40,005 plus the 7,000 new units that could arrive because of mixed use. Based on our resource constraints, we know that we already have resources only available for about 2,000 more units. So we see this as a real dichotomy of your resource constraints on one side can allow so many units, and yet we keep talking as if we can go up to 7,000 or whatever. We disagree with the staff recommendation that a long-term cap on the number of housing units be removed. We believe residents need to know what number of units our resources can actually support. We recommend that there be an additional policy to remove many of the incentives for mixed use. It was originally thought that we needed these incentives to make mixed use attractive in order to produce affordable units. But what we have gotten are too many luxury units in massive, unattractive buildings. There is no evidence that this trend will change, absent some policy changes and probably some ordinance changes. We are concerned that the policies before you don't really tell us how we're going to get more available housing for the low and moderate income workers we have. Policies that just talk about housing, say more density, more market rate units, these are really not going to cut it. We need to figure out how to reserve our resources for our workers, and we need to make sure that we will not use up all our resources now, but that we leave some for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ray, is he here? No. Okay, Joyce McCullough, followed by Lee Moldaver. And then Teddy Gasser will be the last speaker.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm here to represent Habitat for Humanity, which has just begun a new 4-unit project on the west side. So I am speaking here as an advocate for affordable housing. And I particularly appreciate the specific focus of H1, which discusses partnerships between builders and developers to explore potential infill sites. So I hope that you really concentrate on that and keep us in mind. And it is my belief that we can do better. The general plan sets out a number of units, many of which are never built. And so I just hope that as we go forward in this general plan season, that we really do better than we've done in the last 20 years of making housing an actuality instead of just a goal. I believe that we should do everything that we can in this general plan to address that imbalance between jobs and housing, and that this plan should really facilitate maximization of affordable units in our town for its overall community health. Mr. House mentioned in his comments earlier that this increase in population without a commensurate increase in housing has really resulted in overcrowded and substandard conditions, and we see that from our applicants for Habitat for Humanity housing all of the time. And I believe that building more commercial space is really going to only be made worthwhile if the people that work here also can shop here and live here. Rolling up the sidewalks at 5 o'clock in the afternoon because all of our workers go home is not going to contribute to our commercial health and growth either. So I really appreciate your careful consideration, your support of affordable housing, and I just hope that as we move forward, affordable housing will be more than just a dream. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Lee Moldaver will be followed by Teddy Gasser will be the last speaker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm Lee Moldaver. Hat number one, as Councilwoman Schneider knows, the Creek Committee met last night, and we'd like to thank the staff for their guidance to our input. We had an extensive workshop with John Ledbetter 13 months ago. Betty met with us twice during the year, and the committee and our staff feel pretty confident that the intersect between watershed and water quality and clean beach issues and land use issues are incorporated adequately within this plan. So special thanks to the staff. As you've heard from the testimony this morning, there are different factions in the community and on the council and within the staff about the rate of growth and the direction of growth and the priority for growth for the next 10 to 20 years. And I saw one of our local heroes for most of the meeting was sitting in the corner, Dave Davis, who supervised the last plan. And guess what? Those of you who worked on it 20 years ago, it was exactly the same. My late lamented friend Helen Yost 20 years ago was saying that we wanted option A- because we've already gone way too far and cataclysm lay ahead. And we had people in the chamber and the development community who said that the end of free enterprise as we knew it was just around the corner if we didn't bulk up on our development potential. And as you see, both were right. The city doesn't exist anymore, and we're meeting in a virtual wasteland field. One thing I would like to share with you, two of the brightest people I've ever met in California had one saying in common. And one, some of you knew from his UCSB days, Professor Harvey Malich. And that was to point out, and think about that as you read this and talk next week, a projection is not a prediction. A projection is a lagging indicator where you connect the dots from past occurrences in certain areas, whether it's business or financial or growth or housing or vehicle miles traveled. It's a lagging indicator. A prediction is much, much harder to get your arms around with confidence. Harvey Malich was one who said that. Bob Wilkinson's friend Peter Schwartz from Global Business Network is one of the top futurists in the world, also likes to say that. And if you just think about the price variation in fuel and energy just this year, where it went from $2.45 to $4.50 a gallon, and now I've actually seen it at $1.69 within the space of 7 months. And do we know what our fuel and energy needs are going to be 5 years from now, let alone 20? The adequacy of our water supply, the Sierra snowpack, 5 years from now, let alone now. No, we don't. I think that all of the key drivers within the community discussion are represented by options in this plan. So I hope when you send this over for environmental review next week, you don't trim it out too much, because I think there's going to be lively and robust data on all of the different options to allow you to make a really informed decision. I like the quote on the front. It resonates with me. I would hope when you do the draft EIR, a better quote that I think builds a bridge between all the points of view in the community is actually the one on the courthouse, which comes from the ancient Latin. God gave us the land, but the skill of man hath built the town. And then finally, when people are talking about what sustainability actually means, I like the definition here, but my favorite one actually comes from Ashley Boren, and that's the only thing she does. She's the president of Sustainable Conservation, and they've been working in this area for 15 or 16 years when things like the natural steppe were considered foreign and exotic. And she's come up with a definition that I think has met the test of time. But I want to thank you for the openness of the process. Those of you at the League of Cities, most cities do not go to this effort to reach out to the community. I want to thank the staff. And the last thing, you always try to consider what is it there that should be. And I'd like to remind you that 25% of the population in our blue-collar and service industries, speaking various languages, some legal renters, many not, are not that well represented for their current and future needs. There are some people who have appeared in the process who said that they speak for them, but those people themselves have very, very rarely during the last year and a half appeared here. So please try to keep their needs, current and future, in mind next week when you deliberate the fate of this document. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Teddy Gasser here? Okay. Then we have no more speaker slips except Bernie Bernstein was here and had to leave, so she wanted me to read this. She said she requests more time for our association. Oh, she's president of the La Mesa Association. For our association analysis of MODA. Specifically, we'd like to study increased density possibility without parking provided, and we will have a meeting early next year. While looking at the updates, remember to think about Cliff Drive in terms of adding stoplights, crosswalks, safe bike lanes from Las Positas to City College. She's right. We are trying to take over Cliff Drive, and as soon as we do that, we will have a community meeting about it. So that's good. So we have no more speakers, and I really want to thank people for staying over. This was very good. So on Tuesday, we will come back, and we will have formulated our brains, or whatever it is, I don't know, to tell you the most wonderful things in the world. So thank you very much. We'll adjourn. And I guess this